Statistics show that at the amateur level, Black's best scoring reply to d4 is actually the Benko Gambit with the move of b5. However, most players are still playing the Benko Gambit wrong, and in this video, Grandmaster Max Lingworth, one of the leading experts of the Benko Gambit, will show you how to play it right. The thing is though that even I was playing this opening wrong in the early 2010s, and even not playing in the best way, I was still able to get to a top 50 blitz rating on chess.com using the Benko as my primary weapon. I think one of the reasons I was so successful with it is I was just able to play this one type of position, really master it and handle it very deeply. And the way I was playing it then was playing moves such as g6 or the move of bishop takes a6 and kind of playing it the more traditional way. But as I will show you in this video, actually the move of e6 is the best move for black, and it's a move that has really revitalized the Benko Gambit from being a system that was considered tricky but objectively not the best, to one that even today modern engines do consider to be a perfectly fine opening. That is, even if white plays all the best moves, black still gets good compensation and fine play at the very end. So it's very exciting for us Benko Gambit fans and for those of you who are maybe more new to the opening. And before I go deeper into some of the details, like why e6 works and why some of these other moves I played don't work so well, there is something cool I want to mention that if you do want to save some time and just be able to have the Grandmaster PGN files of this video and also the model games annotated that will give you that understanding not just to get good positions, which is what this video will cover, but how to actually convert them and win them in your own games, then you might like to check the link in the description or the pinned comment. It'll be at the very least in one of those two. And yeah, that will save you quite a lot of time and greatly improve your results. But my mission here with my channel is to make Grandmaster level understanding of chess accessible to the entire chess community. And that's why this video is going to be quite a deep dive. If you want to support that mission, you can subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment below as well. That's the ways that you can help out, whether you end up, getting my Benko resource or not. Either way, it'll still help. So in any case, let's start with sort of explaining why I'm not such a big fan of bishop a6 or g6 these days. And I'll start with bishop a6. That's probably the more obvious one in terms of why it doesn't work as well. But it's also the move that's kind of the most obvious one, and probably most of you who have played the Benko have probably played it as black. So the problem is basically going to be that in this king walk line with take, I realize black is not forced to take, but also lines with like d6 and queen a5 that the engine suggests are still going to be much better for white if white's able to just castle long, castle short, and play for an e5 break. It's obviously going to be just very pleasant for white. Like I did play this knight a6 myself in a game against Hrant Melkumian, but I did end up losing that game, so I wasn't really that. I wasn't really inclined to repeat it. Let's put it like this. But if we do take the main move of bishop takes f1, king takes f1, d6, and we just play out the normal moves. So this used to be the main line and the way that everybody was kind of playing the Benko in the old days. If you take the Hungarian Grandmaster Pavel Benko, who was the one who kind of invented this whole gambit with b5. Well, basically this was the way he liked to play it, where you just go knight to d7. He'd put the queen on some square like b6 or a5, and then rook b8 to put pressure on the pawn. And to be completely transparent, like if you are just like a not so experienced player, like say below, 1400, 1600, you probably can just know a setup like this. And even if this is the only thing you remember, this position, queen out, rook to b8, you can probably actually have very good results playing at the Benko. Because what you'll kind of notice in a position like this one, for example, is that you do get a lot of active piece play, and you also have some very kind of clear ideas up your sleeve. Okay, it's true they sort of stopped the idea of bringing the knight around this way to get to this outpost. But notice how white has a hard time getting their pieces out because the bishop is needed to defend the pawn, and also white's pawn structure is less flexible than ours. They have two pawn islands to just our one pawn island. And even without the move of knight e8, we do still have ideas such as, with knight g4, we still have ideas such as knight e8 to be able to bring the knight out, trade off the knight, and then the bishop will also be involved in that heavy pressure against the b2 pawn. And then we're not always going to be able to defend it with the rook, because then the pawn a2 might then be hanging. So there's just going to be a lot of tactical problems, a lot of tricks we kind of have in the position here as black. And The problem though is that white is also not forced to go into these these kind of positions. You guys put a few other plans on the board just so you can kind of have a few different things if you do want to have a little bit of variety in how you play position it, you can do that. But the problem though is that this move of a4 started to become known in about 2011 to 2012. And the idea of a4 kind of makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Because in a position like this, we saw how the rooks are just very strong on the open queenside files, right? And so white's dream position is basically to get a blockade on the light squares with moves like, okay, we can't play knight b5 immediately because the pawn needs to be defended, but certainly after, let's say, a move like rook to e1 or queen e2 or such, after some move like this, white will be ready to put a knight on b5, and also after knight goes c4, you're also attacking the queen, so at the end of the day, a position like this is just not really going to be playable for black. Like the engine kind of confirms that. And I've played this myself with black sometimes as well. It's just not very pleasant, and white does just get a pretty nice advantage in a position like this. In fact, there's even probably some better ways to play it. Like the modern engines kind of like to play like rook e1 and rook fb a3, and I think that this approach is even more effective again. Kind of preparing knight to e5, and this one's more. The point remains that let's say if I just play some moves just for argument's sake. Like let's say I just intentionally play like just useless moves just to kind of allow us to see sort of the dream position in action. But like this is really what white is aiming for, to get that blockade of the queen side. We can support it with b5 free as well as needed. And when black is just down a pawn, absolutely no counterplay. So this is essentially what you are trying to avoid when you play the Benko Gambit. Before I move on from bishop a6, I will also mention, because many of you might be using this resource if you play the Benko as black, then you may know that the guys at Chess Mood like to suggest this move of queen to b6. Like they've been suggesting this for a long time, like probably, I don't know, 8 years by the time I'd done this video. But I've also played it myself a bit, and my results weren't too bad, to be fair, but I think there are some problems with it. Like, the idea is basically to go a4, knight a6, and argue that you can use the weakness of the b4 square, so from a human point of view, it is definitely fairly logical. But there are going to be some concrete problems as well with this. So basically, one move that white can play, like it's not the only move that'll give white an advantage. Like certainly a normal approach like this is also going to be significantly better for white, using some kind of similar ideas to what we've seen before. The knight just coming to this very nice square, and also black is having a bit of a hard time to challenge it when you've got the pressure here as such. But the move a5 might even be a stronger one again, after queen b7. I mean, hopefully by showing these ideas, like it isn't also just useful for those of you who are looking to play the Benko as black or just have a new defense against d4. But it's also going to be useful for those of you who play white, because I was a d4, c4 player for pretty much nearly all of my junior years, like well into my teens. I was almost exclusively playing d4, c4. And the Benko was the opening that by far I had the worst results against as white. And the only way I actually managed to avoid just having these frustrating, stupid losses to the opening was basically by learning how to play it as black. So it's kind of a funny thing, but like the best way to kind of keep being the Benko as white is just to learn it with the black pieces. And so I hope that this video, will also be very valuable also to those who do play d4 and c4 with white, and I know that's quite a lot of you. So anyway, that does explain, why you don't really kind of see this approach anymore. Like you just don't really see strong players play bishop a6 generally speaking, like unless they're just goofing off in bullet or something. But yeah, once you start to play players like 2000 plus, it just starts to become a little bit difficult to kind of justify this approach as black. Like white's edge is just objectively a bit too high. And I kind of knew this for a long time, and I remember this was sort of what happened was I was actually playing the Benko originally in like 2009 to 2012 or so, or let's say 2011. I was playing it a bit, and actually I remember I very nearly got my first win against a Grandmaster with the black pieces with the Benko Gambit. Like it was only by massively choking at the end I failed to win the game. But basically, in what happened was because of this move of a4, I sort of stopped playing the Benko for a few years, and then I saw the Serbian Grandmaster Perunovic actually start to play this move of g6. And this is actually known as the Perunovic variation, where instead of playing bishop a6 and transposing to what we saw just before, instead we actually delayed it or even avoid the capture and played bishop to g7 instead. I'm going to put in a few variations as I record this video, just so that those who end up like buying the PGN file for a small fee can, we'll sort of like get get a good quality file in that sense. So after bishop to g7, so basically the idea, like Perunovic's idea, was that after castles and the move at knight f3, which is the one you will face the most often by some margin in your games. Well, his idea wasn't to take the pawn and just let white just develop and consolidate the extra pawn. Rather, his idea was to play the move of queen at a5. And there were different times in my life where I was very much thinking about creating a course on this variation, because it's one I played quite a lot on chess.com and really had very good results with. And I mean, by this time, when you get to this point, this position is actually going to be quite fine for black. A common mistake you'll often see, well, maybe mistake is a bit strong, but like inaccuracy you'll often see players play at lower levels, and one I faced quite a lot was bishop a6, which kind of explains a little bit why I played queen a5. It allows us to take back with the queen, and then they're not able to castle because our queen is in the way. And I mean, those of you who have a little bit of experience with the Benko will kind of know that the Benko endgames is generally very pleasant for black. Like if they take already, the position is going to be better from black's perspective, because they're also going to have a hard time stopping our knights coming in at d3. And this is actually the first principle that you might want to put in the comments below to make sure that you remember it, which is that Benko endgames are good for black. And the reason for that is because it just becomes harder and harder for white to defend their weaknesses, to cover their weaknesses, once the queens have left the board. Now, there are other ways you can also play it from here, to be fair. For example, like the way the Indian likes to play it, and approach I also played a little bit myself, was the move of e6, and it's kind of playing in a Blumenfeld style with d5. And I remember there was actually a game that I think it was in 2014, like Shanklin lost some train game. I think it was against Indrich, but I cannot remember exactly. It was against like one of the Serbian players where like, he just went like d5 and just got a really strong initiative in the center, and he kind of went on to win. And that's going to be like very coded with some of our like Blumenfeld style ideas. We'll see, like, for example, like the image just above me, with the move of e6. So that's kind of a nice way to introduce some of those concepts. And this really is like one of my philosophies as well when it comes to openings. That if you've watched the channel for a while, you'll notice by now. But basically, the idea that in order to really master an opening, it's not enough just to say, okay, these are just the moves you play as like a very narrow repertoire, like most courses tend to do. But it's also important, in my opinion, to know why the other moves don't work, because that will also give you some ideas of what to avoid, and also there'll often be a lot of ideas in other variations or other moves that can be played that you can then apply in the given recommended variation. So that's just something I personally strongly believe in, and there are also some other cool traps, like if you do want to try and pause video and figure out for yourself why to move bishop d3 is a mistake, then you're certainly welcome to do so. This was a mistake that is even played by Boris Gelfand, a world championship finalist, as white against Magnus Carlsen. But this is something I have covered in quite a few videos in the past, so that's why I'm not going to just, reheat the old nachos here. But the problem with Black's approach, though, is that the move of a7 is actually quite an annoying one, where after it takes... So the reason this is so annoying is that now you don't really have the move of queen a5 anymore. E6 is the main move, I'll get to in a moment. But the problem with queen a5 is that now after bishop d2, white now has the threat of knight to b5, discovering attack on the queen and also the rook, meaning that, yeah, bishop a6 is just clearly not going to work anymore. You just lose the exchange, basically. So for that reason, that's kind of why black then has to switch more to a Blumenfeld style play. And you might be already thinking, well, if we have to play e6 anyway, Max, why not just play it on move 5 and just get it over and done with? Which, yeah, is kind of how this video so it came to be. But the position that you're going to get is basically one like this, which I have played it a fair bit myself with the black pieces. But I have to admit, my results weren't really all that great from these positions. And while probably a little bit of it is probably just due to like some laziness and not like being willing to memorize like 30 moves of theory just to make the worst side of a draw. I mean, just that itself kind of tells you this is not the most exciting position for black to play. Like it's clear that black is playing more or less purely just to try to hold, not for any real sort of winning chances. there's also evidence in the database where like basically the results are like basically white wins quite a lot of the recent games, and a lot of the other ones end up being draws. There are some that black has won, but they're mainly in sort of like blitz chess that tends to be, very unpredictable by its nature. But yeah, I just can't with a clean conscience kind of recommend this playing this way because white is just sort of slightly better, and it's just very hard to get a kind of dynamic play that Benko players sort of want. And like I guess I think the upside of like memorizing all theory to eventually grovel for a draw is just I think not really in the spirit of the opening. There are also some other annoying ideas. Like I know in 2020, for example, for the chess improvement group that I was running back then, I was kind of showing some cool ideas with the move of h4, where you end up like sacking the pawn, but you end up getting a really strong attack. And like at that time, the engines weren't really strong enough to kind of figure out everything that was sort of going on in the positions. But nowadays, it's not the position where, okay, from a computer point of view, like you can probably survive this attack as black, but from a human point of view, like white's attack is just so easy to play. The attacking moves just very natural, like knight g5 and all that stuff. And yeah, again, it's just something where when we play the Benko, like usually where you want to be the ones attacking, not the ones getting attacked as such. So yeah, e5 is also a little bit of a problematic move, being completely honest. So there was one other idea I will show, just because it's kind of useful for those who sort of play the King's Indian or like Grunfeld. I will mention if they do play the Fianchetto. This sort of was Perunovich's kind of other idea that he also wanted to have some extra flexibility against the Fianchetto setup. Because if you play Bishop A6, the Apician lines where you go like Queen B, Rook B1 and Queen C2 and this sort of thing is kind of known to give White a sort of fairly pleasant advantage, where Black sort of struggles to get the counterplay when like the knight will be dominated on b6 by the b3 pawn and stuff like that. So it's a very safe approach for White. But then Perunovic kind of realized that there are some different move orders you can kind of use to your advantage. These are, I think, yeah, the move of like there's sort of two options. Like you can either go knight b to d7 and kind of play this where basically you're trying to get an improved version of the bishop a6 lines, making a point that the Apician variation is just not really going to work anymore when you've got bishop f5, so you kind of avoid White's best setup with some tactical ideas kind of up your sleeve. And also the other approach you can go for is like knight a6 and playing something like this with bishop f5 and just trying to get the bishop sort of raking the board and against this opposition where like in both cases White is probably a tiny bit better if they play it correctly, but you do get very natural Benko play and experience in the statistics time to guess the position is easier for black to play in practice, despite white having, a small, advantage according to the computer. Because, I mean, our opponents, are not computers. Well, at least not that yet. The Elon Musk type implants are, not yet been invented. But on a more serious note, let's get to how we do want to play the Benko. So in this position, the move of e6 is going to be what we are focused on. And actually, I have covered this for in some like different videos in the past, but they were kind of like under like paid courses and stuff. So I figured, yeah, let me just sort of go into a deep dive, like even deeper than what I covered in some of my paid courses in the past, and just show you everything that you really need to know in order to play e6 successfully with black. And also, like later on in the video, just so you know, I will also be covering the alternatives, like what happens if they don't take these pawns. At the same time, you're going to face like CV5 and VA6 like in most of your games overall. So it does make sense to start there and really go deep into it, and then cover the sidelines a bit later from there. So at this point, there's really two major options for white. I'm going to focus on the move of knight c3 first, just think that's a more natural one. But we'll also look at d6 and the kind of Blumenfeld style play that can arise from there, since those positions definitely have a lot of interesting aspects to them also. But let's start with the knight c3. It is a move that's a little bit more common, and yeah, we're going to play e takes d5, knight takes d5. Here you actually have a little bit of a choice available to you. The way that they used to play it back in the older days, until maybe 5 or so years ago, they were mainly playing the move of bishop to e7 back then. We're going to see a bit later that knight a6 is the move I will be recommending here, but I do want to mention that bishop e7 is actually not that bad of an alternative. And I think it's always nice when you sort of have a shortcut like the Benko Gambit is, where you actually have a few different ways of playing it. Because it means that if one line you just don't like playing anymore, or your opponent's kind of getting used to it, you can easily then pick up a new one and still kind of play the opening successfully. But basically, the key position that kind of arises after Bishop E7 is going to be these lines with like takes, takes, and there's a couple of different approaches one can go for, like E3 and Bishop F4 are both kind of a somewhat similar level of popularity. I'll start with Bishop F4 first, just because that's kind of the way the correspondence players were kind of playing it many years ago. But they basically would get a position like this, where from a computer point of view, yeah, you are able to sort of gradually equalize the chances from here with moves like Rook to D8. Like basically you're waiting for him to move the bishop. Like this is a theme that's actually kind of important to know in the Benko. We saw it a little bit in the Perunovic lines of Queen A5 already, but the idea is you want to wait for them to move their bishop first, and only then do you take on A6. So you kind of gain a tempo if they play bishop A6 later. And if they castle, yeah, you can just play like knight C6. And yeah, there were a bunch of correspondence games kind of showing that this sort of position is basically going to be fine for black here as such. Obviously, they could also play bishop A6 first. It would just transpose, however. So taking it from this point though, I mean, white does have a few options. Like I'm not going to go as deep into bishop E7 as I will knight A6. Because once again, I do feel like this is a sort of line where even though you probably could make it work up to a certain level, like maybe like 2 300, 400 for winning chances, I do still feel like it is a line kind of designed just to play for a solid draw. Yeah, which sort of looks weird in a way when you're sort of sacrificing, but yeah, just to me, it just feels like, the position is going to just get dry very quickly from here. That, black is going to have enough compensation, but it's just going to liquidate very quickly one way or another. I'm not going to like play out line until all the way to liquidation, but kind of like if you see a move like B4 that was played like in this Lysiege against Popov game in, Tile Tuesday 2024, for example. Like you kind of even see that here, like a position like this, the piece is all kind of hoovering off and it's just heading to a draw, which, okay, in the game, Black was outrated by like a lot of points, like over 300 rated points. I mean, he was thrilled to bits to get a draw, but obviously, yeah, if you're playing against a player like lower rated, this is not going to be such an appealing option by comparison. There are other moves they can play, like A3 is a move, Queen E2 is also a move. A3 is the way the engine kind of recommends playing it, and if you do want to explore this yourself, despite my, I guess, warning of sorts, I will mention that probably H6 is going to be the most reliable move, and you can try to play some moves like 94. But again, it's still the same point. Like they can just play B4 and you get a position that, yeah, I mean, you're going to draw without any real problems here, but you're not really going to be winning a position like this unless your opponent does something incredibly reckless. And so, yeah, that's just kind of why I just can't really, I think, recommend this with a clean conscience, for those who really want to play in the spirit of the Benko. But if you're happy with a draw, then bishop e7 is not such a bad alternative. And I mean, they can also play e3, this is true. But I do think those positions at least are a little bit more interesting by comparison. Like the move of knight e4 is one that's kind of a bit rare. Like normally black ends up playing bishop a6 or d5 in practice. But we've already kind of seen how we usually want to wait for them to develop the bishop first because we're kind of just helping them to just castle their king and consolidate when we kind of play it like this. So at least d5, does at least wait for the bishop to move, and then going bishop a6 makes a little bit more sense. But e94 is kind of the engine's idea, which I think is quite a cool one. Again, you're basically making the point that you actually kind of benefit from not having played the move d5 so quickly. Because there can be some fun ideas, like say if they take and then you castle, like you can even play like some rook lifts in some positions. That's kind of one of the sort of the concepts. Maybe not immediately, but you can play a move like knight c6 and play something like this where you are going to get that sort of that really fast play against the white queen side. And if you analyze this more deeply, there was a correspondence game class against Nichols that sort of ended in a draw fairly soon from here. But I think still also here the point kind of remains the same that yeah, you can eventually equalize if you know a couple of salties like this 94 that I just showed you. But at the end of the day, yeah, I think that the position is one where like white is not really risking anything. Like I think only white can, yeah, really sort of be the one trying to press him from a situation like this. And so that's going to be the reason why I'm going to focus more on knight a6 in this training. Now, I'll also mention very briefly if they do play knight d5. Like this, I think is just going to be quite good for white. Like I just don't really see black's compensation in a position like this one. Like yeah, if you go bishop e7, like it's just not really obvious why black is playing in this way. Like you're not getting any sort of compensation for the pawn whatsoever. And I'm kind of surprised actually this is as common as it is in the database. But like this is kind of the refutation for those who are curious from White's point of view. So in any case, let's go to knight a6 when we're at our key move. I'm also going to add some exclamation marks as well, just to make sure that yeah, those who are looking just at the PGN and not wanting to watch a whole long video again, so you can get your bearings a lot more quickly. So anyway, the move of bishop g5 is the most common. That is a direction that we are going to focus on. At first, of course, there are a few alternatives. Like they can play knight f3 and e4. Like those are kind of the two moves you're really going to see the most often. And other moves like say knight f6, e3, g3. I might touch on really briefly at the end. We'll kind of see how it goes with the time. But basically, yeah, I think that a lot of these moves you'll be able to apply like similar ideas to what we'll see in the other variations. Like you'll just get better versions of what we see elsewhere. So bishop to g5 is the move we will focus on, and yeah, here you actually have a little bit of a choice as it turns out. So the move bishop e7 is the usual move, just breaking the pin, and already in this case you can kind of see how in a position like this one that the bishop is on g5 rather than f4. So it does almost feel like you got a little bit better version of some of those bishop e7 lines. But there is also a very interesting alternative that actually I'm going to start with, because I think this might actually appeal more to some of you watching, and that's the move of rook to b8, which is kind of how the engines are suggesting it in recent times as a very intriguing option. So obviously, yeah, you are allowing double pawns. That is something that looks rather scary at first glance. But you do get some interesting play here by meeting queen d2 with the move of knight to b4. And you have this really epic idea where you can actually play queen e3 and now queen to e7, where you just like sacrifice the queen because you've got this knight c2 threat. It's just a very devilish trick by black in this case. Now after knight takes e2 and knight takes e7, knight c2, king to d2. I'm kind of curious if we do play out this position with knight c8 and knight takes f1 and this whole sequence with rook d1. Interesting point. We're actually not going to take the knight. We're actually going to play rook b2 and just kind of play more for the initiative here. Because after king c3, the point is that we can still get their knight anyway. Because after knight a7, rook b7 has happened in a game between Jakiria against Harry Bryant. Black was able to get the piece back and just have a very good game. With this kind of thing. I won't include the game in the PGN file because like the players are like 2,200s, but at least that shows you even the average chess player can still make this work in a sense. You don't have to be a computer to play this way. But if White does play it a bit better, like knight h3 is probably the more critical move for White in order to have a good grip over the d5 square. I'd like just out of interest, like from a human point of view, like how would you evaluate this position as Black? And then it is Black to move for those who are wondering. So my take on it is that I do think that White is the one who is pressing in a position like this, because an iron d5 is going to be quite a nice outpost. But I also think we have enough active play that we can still make it work as Black. Like there's a lot of moves you can explore, like the move like rook a8 and just kind of sacking the pawn on f6 for some very active players, kind of the way that the engines like to play it. But I also think it's a kind of position where like the game the Fury is not going to be so costly. Like you can play bishop d6 also. You can play f5 or bishop g7 and get a bishop out that way. And I think in all these cases, the evaluation is similar. Like, white's position is easier to play, but I do think black can hold without too much trouble. And I think there is enough imbalance in the position that you can, definitely play for the win, I think, with either side at this point. So I think as a worst case, it's not so bad for black. I will also mention a kind of interesting novelty of king to C2 is kind of funny. The engine wants to play it this way, but it does end up just transposing after all, so it doesn't really change anything. But just a funny thing I thought I'd mention. Just going back as well, just to make sure I didn't miss any really important moves. So there was a game with Queen takes e7 with a somewhat old GM playing with whites. But I mean, black is obviously just very comfortable in a position like this one. Like he's got a massive lead in development, and he's not getting this Marshall style compensation for the pawn with the bishop pair and strong center and all of that. So let's also see if there are any other alternatives that are also worth mentioning. I mean, knight takes b4 is another move that if they kind of see this queen e7 coming, they might decide to just play it like a little bit differently. But knight takes b4, rook b4 is kind of the idea of rook b8. You just want to get your rook as active as possible and kind of put some pressure on b2 before white is fully consolidated. After e3, there's again a few ways you can play it. Like you can go queen b6 and just make it really hard for them to kind of get their pieces out, and just kind of play all these annoying moves where you just make it hard for white to fully consolidate. Like probably the acid test is going to be something like bishop e2, but I mean I think in a position like this, like you're not down material, you've got the bishop pair, you've got some potential with your centers, so again I think an endgame like this I just wouldn't really be too concerned about from Black's perspective. Like initially the engine's saying white's slightly better, but I think if you go deeper into it, it will turn out to slowly move closer and closer towards equality. And I mean that's sort of the way that most like GMs these days kind of play the openings with black is to pick these sort of shortcuts that the opponent may not have seen, so you're playing against the opponent, not against their engine. But where even if you do kind of play that series, like you go deeper and that sort of small edge white starts to kind of slowly dilute down as you sort of go deeper and deeper into the position. Like that's really the modern approach you see these days. And also if they do play a3, you do also get very good compensation here as well with moves like rook g8, just kind of putting pressure on the king like that. And if they play e4, like there are different moves like bishop g7, f5. Like it's not something I would spend too much time on, but just mentioning it for completeness sake. And if they don't play queen d2, you can just kind of play knight b4, like in a position like this, for instance. Because if you do play rook b2, like this is a novelty, by the way, by whites. This is very much fresh territory. But you can sort of see how this queen e3 is a lot more annoying when you don't have the knight in. So that's kind of why we would, play this way anyway. And probably there's something like this is actually a good direction for white to explore, because this is perhaps the line where maybe white can have the best chances for an advantage. That being said, we do have some tricks like d4 and stuff like this that do allow us to kind of liquidate the pieces, and you are going to have good compensation with the bishop pair and the lead in development and pressure on the king and so forth. And also if e3, just bishop f5, and they kind of have to find some tricky moves like knight h4 to kind of fight for an advantage. But even then, I still think black's just going to have very good compensation in a position like this, for example. And let's put a move on the board like rook g8, and the game goes on. So I think that shows the picture pretty well with like bishop f6. Now what if they play a different move? Like what if they play knight f6, or play the engine suggestion of knight f3, which I would be quite impressed actually if someone found knight f3 without knowing it was the engine move. But okay, knight f6, we'll sort of see in this case we actually kind of get what we want here. So if they play bishop d2, you can actually just take back the pawn and bishop to c3. There's actually this really cool trick in the position where if you want to try and find it, you can pause the video and see if you can spot it. Maybe also put it in the comments below what you think the move is for black to see if you got it right. So don't be shy to put in the comments. Kobe Bryant's, I've been saying it's quite so many times to students lately, but Kobe Bryant did say that there's no such thing as failure. Like the only way you fail is if you completely give up. But the answer is that c4 is a really good move. And they just can't take the rook. We sack the rook because we've got bishop e4 and we win the queen. So if they do play bishop c1 though, then you can just kind of play c4, and again this bishop b4 check is kind of the key idea that really makes this flow for black. Now I do think that knight f3 is actually probably a good move by whites, and I'm sort of surprised it hasn't been played before, but I guess that sort of speaks to the surprise value of rook b8, like a shortcut within a shortcut. The idea of it though is that if you do play rook b2, that this queen c1 again is just going to be a bit of a pain in the neck for black. Like after say, well, the threat is obviously queen e3 like we've seen before, but after queen a5, 92. Yeah, this is just going to be kind of just a good position for whites. Like you don't really get the same compensation for the pawn that we kind of saw in some of the other lines. Like white will just be able to sort of consolidate. And so for this reason, I do think it is better just to play the move of bishop to e7 instead. And I mean, in that case, after takes, it's going to kind of transpose into the lines with like bishop e7 on move 8. So it turns out that, yeah, if they do notice knight f3 that has never been played before in my mega database, well, yeah, then it's just going to lead back to the other positions. But I do think this is a move that does have some surprise value and will, I think, throw your opponents off quite a bit. So that's kind of a nice point in our favor. But let's focus on bishop e7 because yeah, you kind of have to know how to play those positions anyway, as we kind of saw before. But after knight e7, queen e7, and knight f3, they can also play the move of e3 as well here. But after e3, yeah, we'll get to that a little bit later in the video. But I will mention for now that like queen e5 is going to be quite a good reply for those who are wondering about it. But after knight f3, there's kind of a few different ways that you can sort of play it here as black. So basically the moves of like castles, h6 and rook b8 are kind of the choices you sort of have. And lately strong players have kind of been playing the move of rook b8 first. But the thing is that if you do play h6 instead in this position, the up to bishop h4 black's generally playing the move of rook b8 anyway. Or at least this is the way that they should play it according to the computer. So a lot of the case actually it's going to kind of transpose like the two different lines. Maybe it is a good moment just to kind of explain briefly why like the natural castling is maybe not such a good option for black here. Because also in h6 bishop h4 like black was often castling in our position as well. Like obviously that would kind of could transpose in this in a case like this. But kind of the problem for black is that you just sort of having that on a6 is a lot worse than having the bishop on a6 if we kind of compare to some of the other lines that we saw, with the bishop e7 on move 7, right? And so let's say if you play a move like d5, which is the way that they're normally playing it. Well, in that case, like you kind of just go bishop to e2, and yeah, it just doesn't quite work out for black. Like say you go rook d8 and play like the same way as if the bishop was on a6. So then castle, there were some correspondence games actually in these positions where there were some like high level players who end up like holding a draw as black, but in those games, White played the move of knight d2, and while knight d2 probably still gives, some sort of advantage for White, at least Black was able to kind of hold the draw in some of the correspondence games from this position. But I also noticed this move at a3 kind of doing even better for White, just sort of taking away this knight b4, and I think it's kind of hard to know what Black should really do in a position like this. Like say if you go, for example, knight bishop f5 and just try and develop. I mean, the correspondence games are playing like Rook C1 and like moves like H5 just don't really have the desired effects. Like White can even just allow Knight G3 because the attack with the against the weak king is it's just a little bit too much for Black to deal with here. Going to the machine. And if you do play Bishop G6 again, White just has these moves where it's able to consolidate and you're kind of just down a pawn at the end of the day. So I realize that that's a little bit of a long explanation, but I do think it is important to understand White Castle's a mistake, because if you don't, I think it would be very easy to happen that you just forget your preparation, you castle because it just seems so natural, like you don't even think about it, and then you realize a bit too late the problem with it. Whereas if you understand why it's bad, well, you're not going to make that mistake in your own games, even if you don't remember the theory right away, you'll kind of remember it instinctively. So that explains why I do advocate for the move of Rook B8, and I'm going to check really quickly if there are like any big differences, like just in a position like this, if we play h6 in this kind of version. Because I was sort of thinking to myself, like maybe White's not forced to go bishop h4. Maybe they can, try something like bishop f4 or some other bishop retreat or something to try to get some value from the move order. Um, yeah, if we do compare, like I'm sort of figuring it out in real time to see if there is any big difference. But I do think this could be a reason maybe for why h6 first might be a little bit more precise in my opinion. Because if bishop f4, I think yeah, it's kind of nice to have knight b4 and like not have your rook attacked. I think is going to be quite a good thing for us here. And yeah, we also have some tricks like queen e4 to keep the momentum and not allow white to consolidate the position. We've got rook c5, queen d4 tricks kind of up our sleeve, and this happened also in a game between like Wojciech and Shevchenko. That game did end in a draw ultimately. So doing like a nice high level pedigree there. And if they do play a move like bishop d2 instead of this, yeah, I mean in this case like even just castles and knight e4 I think is going to be very healthy. To be fair, bishop e2 actually is a move that maybe deserves to be a little bit more popular than it has been in practice. Because it's not such a bad idea to, consolidate the position a little bit. But I do think, yeah, if you just play normal moves, like I don't really see the problem for black. Like you can either keep the tension with, d5 and just, kind of play with the active pieces, or, you can get rid of their bishop pair and play it that way. And I just think either way, black is just going to be totally fine with the active piece play and the pressure on the b2 pawn to kind of boot. So bishop h4, yeah, that's the move we're going to focus on. But just want to kind of make sure we close that open loop in a sense. So white normally will play the move of b3 as kind of discussed. Now you might be wondering, well, what if white plays a little bit differently? Like what if they play a move such as e3 or a bit of a novelty? Well, maybe I won't be novelty if I after I play a move on the board, but at least in excluding transpositions, a novelty of queen to c1. So what happens after some of these different options? I'm going to start with the move of b3 because that is by quite some margin the most common one. And this also allows us to see kind of one of the ideas of playing rook d8. So one of the main ideas is actually to play the move of rook b6 and be able to develop the bishop, but where your rook is able to kind of swing along across that third rank. So e3, we play the move bishop to b7, and that way just kind of keeps some flexibility. So the move rook c1 is a move that you will normally see, but there also have been a couple of games with bishop e2 as well. If they do play bishop e2, I think a nice approach that was actually played in a couple of Tile Tuesday games by player Rostomyan was this move of g5 and just going h5 and just like very directly going after the bishop, which yeah probably is a bit of a cleaner approach than castling. Because in those games, well, there are like a few games, but knight g5 is kind of the you could say like principled move by white, rather than just going into these kind of positions where white will also have some problems with the king's safety. Rather than that, the move knight g5 yeah seems more natural perhaps, but after bishop f4 and now this move at knight d5, I do think black is actually in pretty good shape. For example, like there were a couple of games in the database, like kind of a win, like it was a win and a loss for black. But Black was also kind of outrated by nearly 200 points in both games. So that's actually a pretty big achievement from Black's perspective. So in the game that White won, White played the move Queen d2, and in the game they lost, they played castles. I mean, after castles, yeah, Black just played like Rook g8 and Knight c3, and I mean, Knight f3 is obviously a mistake by White to be fair, but this is to kind of show you like just how the attack kind of looks in practice. That after Queen e4, we're just threatening the knight because of the pin, and white just doesn't really have a good way out of it because king h1, does run into h3, and your white is getting destroyed on the light squares, much like a crazy house chess game. But after queen to d2, again, you can just play like I kind of like the move order of h3. Actually, I think it's kind of a more shocking move than rook g8. Because obviously, if they take, they run into some problems down the long diagonal, as you can see here. But if they do play a move like queen b2, which is the way the engine wants to play it, well, you have a couple of different replies. Like you can play, rook h6. The move f6 leads to a bit more computerish lines, but it's also going to be fine just to provoke provoke knight tree and get this sort of thing in. Like it can lead to a very weird position. Like all three results are probably possible in a position like this one. But you can also play rook h6. That's also going to be totally fine, and you can get some like nice rook lifts against the king, and it's always fun when you kind of play in this very creative attacking style, almost like Arjun Erigaici sort of coded. But that does explain a little bit why the move of rook c1 is considered more critical. I will also say, like, for those of you who are looking for a system from White's point of view, I do think moves like A4 and A3 are very interesting novelties here. There's different ways that like Black can play. Like, I'm not terribly concerned, but I do think this is an approach where White can try to fight for a little something if you do want to look for a system from White's point of view, or if you are a like professional, looking and playing this from Black's point of view, like even against like other top players. And also A3 is another interesting option, though I will say I think that this and 94 should be a pretty good reply here. So again, not too bothered by it. But these are sort of things that someone who's preparing with like Stockfish or Layla Zero might prepare against you if you're like playing at a really top level. So, for sake of electromancy, I did just want to mention it before moving on. Now with the move of Rook to C1, we can either castle or play G5, but I think castling is just going to make more sense here. White normally does play the move of A3. Because if you wait too long, there's going to be problems with like Knight B4 and, for example, like A3, you kind of have some tricks where you can play like Bishop takes and they kind of have to make some concessions because Bishop here, Rook D6 is actually going to be winning material with Knight to D3. Show some of the value of having that Rook B6, Rook lift having been played beforehand. Type Rook lift in the comments just so I know you understood it. So after A3, we can play it a couple of different ways. Like Rook A8, Knight C7 is kind of going to transpose either way, actually. So this is kind of what happened in like a couple of, I think it was correspondence games if I'm understanding correctly. Yeah, these were both played in correspondence quite recently, as it turns out. So it's kind of funny. Like, there's a bit of a glitch in the database where, like, I'm sort of when I click this, it'll then show like the other game for some reason. But anyway, I digress. So I normally will play. We'll normally play the move of A4 here, because obviously we can get back to the pawn. Like, we're not really going to be any particular sort of danger. If you want to avoid 92, you can also just take. Like, that's also going to be totally fine, even if the position is maybe simplifying a bit towards a draw in a sequence like this. Obviously, we're not forced to play into this, but it is worth pointing out like there are some lines that that can lead to a very dry and like very drawish position like this. But that's also like chess in a way. Like when you analyze anything deep enough with the computer, like you'll eventually get to some variations where the position just liquidates. But the point is that I have also shown like a few other like ways black can play it. So there are ways to try and catch out the opponent or like just keep some more play on the board. Especially if you are willing to risk a bit of a disadvantage, then you do have those options to like play it differently against a low rate player. Like for example, if let's say you just want to like get the opponent out of engine prep. I mean, it's not going to matter for like 99.99% of you, but you can also just play a move like Rook B8 as well and say, okay, what are you going to do against a different move? And yeah, White probably does have a bit more of an advantage in that case. But there are ways, to kind of get them thinking on their own if you're a little bit resourceful with it. Probably I should also mention, by the way, if they do play B4, that yeah, having the move of Rook A3 does kind of help a lot in that case to get the kind of active piece play that you were sort of looking for as such. But A4, yeah, really is kind of the more key move, and there's a couple of ways that you can play it, but the general idea is going to be to bring the knight to B4. Again, you could obviously go this way as well, and it would end up being a transposition. But from this position here, so it's a game between Babon Cavallo against Oprizor, and it is a game that I will. Sorry, my chess base is kind of glitching out on me a little bit. Okay, there we go. I was just like adding the game to Patreon for those who end up purchasing it. So after G5, like this is how the game. I will still show you the game. Like you know I'm not that sort of person to hide it. But basically the way the game played it was like knight D2, D5, and I don't know that there were correspondence like that is correspondence game not really going to be indicative of necessarily what you'll get in your actual games. Like it's more kind of like what happens if two engines play each other kind of thing. But basically, like this is how it played, where like they just played these moves up. This was like Champions League 2024 ICCF, and they just kind of played out these moves, and eventually, like a draw was agreed around this point. So that kind of confirms, that theoretically, at least the position is not going to be worse. Like the knight's just so annoying that they just can't really, the white just can't really consolidate the extra pawn in a case like this. I don't think in a human game, like I think all three results are possible because the engine's kind of saying the best lines are often going to involve like sacking the exchange, and that's often going to lead to a very spicy position and very unbalanced position after that. But yeah, I think that gives a pretty good picture of what happens in kind of the main line as such. And they also could play moves like e3 or queen c1. So let's have a little bit of a look at that. Now, in practice, the move at e3 was played in a couple of games, but that does give back the pawn. I mean, one idea is saying, okay, I don't want to try and consolidate the pawn, but I just want to catch up in development and try to, sort of fight for the initiative again. But again, I don't really see this being particularly a problem for black. Actually, there was even a game like in late 2025, like in December, the player a 2-200 one against player 2-100. So in that game, black played bishop b7, but I do think that the move of to be fair, bishop e7 is probably fine as well, but I do think knight b4 is probably just a tiny bit more precise, like just get the knight to a better post. There's a couple of ways you can play it, like you can play it with d5 if you just want happy to liquidate to a position that will be a little bit dry. And maybe it's not fair to say it's going to be drawish, because actually this position is actually kind of imbalanced, this sort of endgame. It's not just going to be an automatic draw with the passed pawn here to work with, and so after bishop d7, the bishop versus knight imbalance as well. So it's not a dry position, but yeah, in this case, yeah, the move at knight c6 is also possible if you do want to keep more tension in the position. In history, you are probably giving white some small edge if you play knight c6, but yeah, against a lower rated play, that can be a way to sort of keep the game going. So I put it as an interesting thing just for those who have the Patreon file to make it a bit easier. But after queen to c1, if they do play this move, which is a novelty by the way, we can just play knight b4, e3, queen e4, and that's going to be the way that we'll just get some good counterplay with knight to c2. The positions can get kind of fun actually. Like there are some weird sort of computer lines where you end up like winning the exchange, but white gets white gets a few ideas, bishop to g7 and this sort of thing. But ultimately, it does end up being a fine position for black. Like I'm not sure how far into the weeds this actually necessarily go, but basically, I have like these tricks like c4 or d6 rook a1 c4. There's kind of like two different ways to do it, but they basically end up kind of getting back one of the bishops and the rising position with something like this, for example, is just going to be about equal. Like you'll get back one of the pawns, and yeah, then the material is just fine for black. So okay, I think that kind of shows the picture of the bishop g5 move very well, and I do realize like I've gone pretty deep in this video. It's like 50 minutes in, and we still mainly focused on this. But it is a move you'll face most often, and as you've probably noticed by now, I'm not afraid to go pretty deep into these different variations so that you can really understand them and actually know them better than even most title players would as such. I also do want to check really quickly just to kind of make sure that I'm not kind of missing some sort of subtle move order point, like with Rook B8, and like I'm just thinking to myself, like if there are any sort of benefits to this sort of move order as such. Because if they play Rook B1 in a position like this, I do think that this is just going to be pretty pleasant for Black. The fact that you're going to have some ideas with Bishop F5 and stuff, I think is going to be quite nice. Like A3 and even C4, for example, is a way that you can play it. Although it might actually be more precise to go H6 first and just kind of play it a similar way to what we've kind of seen before. But this C4 is going to be kind of one of the differences where it can sort of where you do have moves like Bishop H5 and then F5 in the mix immediately as well. And if they go Bishop H3, kind of go Knight H5 as one way you can play it to kind of go after the bishop, or also bishop to G4 is also possible. But yeah, I think in this version, yeah, definitely you can see that flicking in this definitely was kind of helpful for us. They don't have to move bishop to F4 compared to that other line. You can kind of just play normal moves and just have like very good compensation with the very active piece play, especially on light squares, and the B2 pawn being fixed to weaknesses is obviously quite nice for us. And also, yeah, if we go back to this position, if they do play Queen C1, again, you can sort of see like H6 is going to be met with Bishop F4 in a lot of positions. So, yeah, I think even just from these examples, you're kind of seeing the value of having flicked in H6. It just makes white kind of commit early and reduces their options a little bit. And of course, that little flicking is always going to be useful later in the game. Now, the move at e3, yeah, this is one I do also want to make sure I address. But yeah, queen e5 is going to be a very good reply. White will almost always play knight f3 because, bishop f6 is just going to be very pleasant. Like, white's usually going to have to give back the pawn and just accept equality, because if they do try to hang on to the pawn, it just ends up being a little bit unpleasant. Like, we just get some really nice pressure, and it just becomes kind of, hard for white to really consolidate in a position like this. Like knight f3 or queen d2, d5, this sort of thing is, an example of how the position can play out. Like, you already have moves such as, like d4 that you can play, if they take, they kind of end up in some hot water with the king in the center. So there's ideas like that make this work. So usually white does end up playing like the move of knight f3 and playing these positions of like bishop c4 and such. And in this case, actually, I do want to mention a little bit of a novelty because almost always black was playing the move of h6, and they're almost always getting a position like this one with like knight e4 and this sort of thing. But a question that to my mind seems like fairly natural to ask is, well, why not just play the move of queen c3 immediately, and just play knight e4 and say you're kind of attacking the bishop and it sort of reduces their options a bit. Well, then there are some like computerish lines where you go like bishop d5 and knight d2 and rook c1. So there's like very sort of computerish, but yeah, if white doesn't play rook c1, they kind of just lose because of the rook being on free. So it's a very important intermezzo. And then there's a couple of different ways you can play it. Like you can go queen to b4 and play a position like this that is going to be just pretty pretty reliable for black. Like white obviously has good compensation, but you're not really in real danger of losing. I think in a position like this one, your knight does defend the weaknesses quite well. And if they do play a different line, like oh, what's something I was going to say? Oh yeah, it was if they're in this position here. There is also the interesting option of playing knight to f3, which also kind of shows some of the benefit of having the attack on the bishop. That does reduce their options a little bit. When you've got ideas like queen e5 to hit the bishop like that. Yeah, it's a bit of a computerish position, but kind of one of the key tricks is that you can sort of meet bishop takes with this bishop to b7 move. They kind of have this little fork you're setting up. And then in a position like this, like if they want to keep the game going, they'll probably play a move like king f3 or rook c2. The computer's saying like king f3, which is kind of a little bit crazy, but at the end of the day, a position like this one is going to be fine for black. Like actually, he constructed like a game with this like about several months ago when I was like preparing for a tournament. But at the end of the day, you're going to sort of either castle your king or trap the bishop with g5. And I mean, a position like this is just going to be totally fine. Like I think that if the opponent plays well, then a draw is a fair outcome, and there's definitely still a lot of fight to be had with black having some ideas to try and get the knight in, for example. So it's an interesting equal position. So yeah, that's kind of my free novelty that I want to share, just showing that there is some benefit to not playing h6. You can kind of kick away the bishop with f6 later in some of the endgame positions. Anyway, I think that's pretty much concludes the picture on the uh, on the move of bishop to g5. So with that, let's now dive into a few of the alternatives. And yeah, for something like if they're not as critical, I will try to be like a little bit more concise with them. But let's see how it goes. So the move that I will cover next is the move of knight to f3, just because it's the next most common move. And in this case, we just play knight takes d5, and this kind of shows the other idea of taking the pawn is also to be able to kick away their queen, which we're going to see in a few lines actually. But here white does have a bit of a choice as to where the queen should go. The moves of queen e5 and queen d1 are the ones you're going to tend to see the most often, and queen e1 is kind of the one you'll tend to see more at like a master level. But there are some other moves, like they can also play like queen e4 and queen d2. So there's definitely a few choice up white's sleeve. There are even also a couple of interesting novelties, like moves like queen f5 or queen b3 or queen g5 that I'm probably not going to cover them because I think it would make the video a little bit long. But just mentioning those moves do exist in case you do want to explore it in your own time. But the move of queen e5 is the most common, but I would say not necessarily the most critical. Because after 96, we are just going to, I think, have very good play with our pieces. White normally does play the move of e4 in this position. There are a couple other moves I also played, which I might get to a little bit later, but e4 is definitely the one that seems the most natural, just taking most space you can. But after bishop e7, we do actually get some pretty nice play. I think actually this position can also arise from like the e4 move order on move 8 to kind of have some good coverage like in that sense as well. But the move of queen d5 yeah, is the one that you'll see as being the most common. Bishop c4 is also seen. We will get to that a little bit later, and again, it's a move that is where you're probably more likely to see at a higher level of play. But if they do play queen to d5, well, let me ask you this: what do you think will be the move to play as black to deal with the threat against our? Yeah, just getting a couple on the checks. My back was going on me a little bit. But the move of rook a4 is one I think I like the best. Like technically rook a7 and preparing bishop b7 is also going to be fine, but I just think rook a4 is just the more active move to play. And after bishop c4, it also sets up this little trick of bishop a6, where much like in the Perunovic variation actually from way back, like this bishop a6, queen a5 is a nice little resource to have up our sleeve, where we just stop their king castling with safety. And we have tricks like knight d4 as well that also give us a pretty decent initiative for the pawn. Like black is the one who is pressing in a position like this. So knight d2 really is the move that white should play here. In that case, yeah, we just castle and let white do their thing, like take, and knight to c4 is the way they usually play it. Just not give black some extra options like knight f4 and some of these attacking ideas against the white king as such. So knight c4 is just to cut that out. But then the move of queen a8 is going to be quite a good reply, where if we are able to trade the queens, we're going to be reasonably happy with the rising endgame. It's after a3, for example. We can take, and knight c7 is just going to be a nice way to get the pawn back. Now the move knight d4 is also reasonable if you do want to play more for long-term compensation. Like obviously something like this is also going to be fine, but it is true you are kind of very bluntly playing for a draw with something like this. Whereas knight d7, yeah, it kind of keeps a bit more fight in the position, like king e2, knight d5, and there are a couple of correspondence games that end in a draw, but I do think this is a position that the imbalance in the structure does give you decent scope to play for a winner's black. So I wouldn't be too perturbed by getting something like this out of out of our preparation. And if they play castle short, it's going to be kind of a similar picture. Just the difference is their king is on g1 instead of e2, which is probably slightly worse, but not really going to significantly change the evaluation at the end of the day. Like black is still going to be fine. Um, yeah, there was a part of me wondering if there was any alternatives, but yeah, probably just keep it simple. So they're not forced to play a3 here, but I think other moves are just going to be quite comfortable for black. If you play castles as white, obviously you can just take back the pawn on a2 at the very least, and queen a8 you're obviously pretty happy to see to get that pressure against the pawn, and a3 knight d4 is going to be a nice demonstration of how we can just have that active piece play and make it very hard for white to fully consolidate their extra pawn here. And just seeing if there are any other moves, like if they do play queen d7. I mean, that's just going to be a bit of a blunder because you have like queen e4 with check, so that's going to be pretty easy. So with that, I think that covers this this queen d5 move fairly well. Because I mean, if they do play something else, it's going to be kind of worse. Like bishop d3 kind of runs into moves like rook b4 and bishop b7, and then the queen is a little bit stuck. So there's going to be little tricks like that around if white does mess up the move order a bit. Now, if they play bishop to c4 instead, I think you might be thinking, well, just play bishop to a6 and just do the same trick as before with the queen a5 move. But white does have the option of queen d5 that is still going to be fine for black, but I do think white does have some chances for an edge in a position like this one, for instance. And so for that reason, rather than going into these kind of positions, I would probably suggest just playing bishop b7 instead and kind of playing more for the pressure with the bishops. So like take some. Also note, by the way, if they do play bishop e6 and queen takes g7, it is going to be a mistake to take g7 because we're just going to have a very strong initiative here. Like, we'll eventually play bishop a6, and the king being stuck in the center is just very, very bad for white. So that's why castles is the move that makes more sense. But yeah, in a position like this, it's basically just going to be fine. Like you can play g6, and you have like a little bit of a choice. Like I think taking is probably more practical than bishop e4. Like I wouldn't like having the king in the center like this. If it's just going to be bad news for us. So let's just castle instead. But after the move like bishop h6, we do have this cool idea of this exchange sack, which I do feel that black has pretty good compensation for the exchange here. Where we've got the bishops kind of raking the board, we've got the b2 pawn's weak, we've got the d5 coming, and if they play bishop e6, you can kind of take either way. You can argue for both. To my mind, f6 is more natural because it's more dynamic, but you can also take with the this pawn here if if you want to just get a position that's I mean you're never really losing when you've got the bishop and this very strong pawn just kind of slowing up the white rooks as it were. So whereas I think it's going to be more to move to play if you do want to maximize your winning chances in a sense with something like this. I suppose if White really wants to, they can play Rook D5 and like give back the exchange to try to bring it more close to equality. But there are also moves like Bishop C6, to allow you to just kind of keep the tension and keep the winning chances alive here as Black. So and also Bishop B7, yeah, it is a novelty as well. So yeah, you definitely it's always something that could catch out your opponents. Let's put it like this. But okay, let's go back to again just thinking to myself there are any other moves worth mentioning. I guess Bishop D3 is not the stupidest idea from White's perspective, but I do think that Bishop A6 is going to be a pretty good reply. I think White's going to kind of get a worse version of the Bishop C4, Bishop A6 lines because we can kind of put a lot of pressure on the E4 pawn. Because in this case we're also forking A2 as well, so a position like this is ultimately just going to be fine for Black. So yeah, Bishop D3 it's a move, but not really something we should be afraid of. With that, just to very quickly touch on what happens if they do play a move like G3 or E3. I think G3 is probably a little bit of a mistake actually, because after Bishop E7, Bishop G2, I just think this pressure is just very annoying down the long diagonal, and it's going to be a bit hard for White to kind of develop their pieces properly. Like if they play Queen D5 trying to avoid the move D5, well, we're just going to play Bishop E7 and just kind of get it in anyway as we would like. We can just play like castles and Queen A8, and we just have this really good pressure against this pawn. We can play a move like D5 as well, and it's just like very hard for for White to really kind of justify their position if we do play out some moves. I realize I kind of putting this in more for like the PGN file students, but just giving an example of like why Black is just doing very well here. And as for the move at E3, it's going to be a somewhat similar story. Like White usually plays a move of Bishop D3 in practice. Bishop C4 is probably better, but even then you could still play some familiar ideas we've kind of seen before with Bishop A6, Queen A5 to to still have a fine position to keep their king in a bit of an awkward spot here. Black is definitely not worse at this point. Bishop E3 is a move that you will tend to see more, and I kind of like the move at D5 as sort of a bit of a novelty over the little bit too autopilot castles, which does run into Queen E4. This is something a couple of players did play as Black and lose with, even including even an IM. So don't fall for that. Play to move D5 first and then castle, and that's going to give you what you want. Actually, it's interesting to see like Ninja saying actually don't not to castle on next move, but you're often going to be sort of flicking in some moves like this first to take the initiative. I mean, even if White does play the best moves, it's still a totally fine position where you're going to get your typical kind of like Blumenfeld sort of play as such. So, and also something I probably should have mentioned for those who don't know what the Blumenfeld Gambit is, because I kind of referenced a lot of times, assuming everyone knew it, but basically the Blumenfeld Gambit is this line where you sort of go C5 and B5, sort of get this kind of like play in the center, like he says A6 kind of seen more, probably a little bit more than the move at D5. Well, at least A6 is kind of the way that the computers like to play it these days, but you can sort of see the parallels, between this position and what we were looking at before with like this line. It's definitely a similar type of play. And also means that, if you are looking for a system against knight f3, like I'm not going to cover like a full d4 repertoire, like with all the sidelines well in this video, because then the video would be like 6 hours or more long. But it's worth mentioning those who do want something against knight f3, you could either explore something like this, where you just kind of play a Benko with a pawn not on c4, which obviously has its own subtleties to it. Or you can play like e6 and make it that if they do try to move audio out of the Benko, then you can still play like b5 and get a kind of Benko style play, and obviously you could also get that via knight f3 e6. So it's one way you can kind of organize your repertoire if you want to base it around playing this on the Gambit style, a lot of different versions. That is a way you can do so with the Blumenfeld Gambit. But in any case, let's go to some of the lines with like knight c3 and let's also check really quickly. Yeah, there are a few other moves they can also play at this point. Like they're not forced to play the move of queen to e5, of course. So the most common alternative, as I mentioned earlier, was the move of queen to d1. Because we saw when the queen's on e5 that the queen's going to get kicked around like a football a bit, right? And so queen e1 avoids that problem. But of course, it is also an undeveloping move. And yeah, d5 is the direction I'm going to focus on today, but I do also want to point out that like also bishop e7 is kind of an interesting alternative, with the idea that you kind of can actually, you're not forced to play d5, but you can play a little bit more with the pieces. For example, like e3, bishop f6. I think a very intriguing option. Like it's probably going to transpose anyway after a later d5 as such, with something like this as it were. But this is an approach, yeah, if you want to explore this in your own time, I think there are some interesting ways to play this and kind of like surprise the opponent. It probably doesn't give like 100% equality, but yeah, it's just a way to like play it a little bit more creatively and get more more fresh kind of position as it were. So but like I said, yeah, a lot of transpositions are kind of likely in this case. So anyway, those are like a few ideas you can play around with if you want to do your own research. But I do think d5 is just going to be the most reliable move in the direction I will focus my efforts for today. So in any case, after d5, white does have a few options. Like I already keyed in the move of e3 initially. Actually, I have a very cool novelty in this position. I will share with you in just a moment. Because the move bishop e6 that black normally plays is not going to be the best one. In fact, but white does have also other moves like g3 and e4, kind of the main ones. I mean, there was also one game with bishop g5, but yeah, it's just going to be not really a problematic position for black at all. Like just getting in like d4 is just going to be very very fine, as was happened in a game between two Armenian women's players. So anyway, let's focus on the move e3. So I have a really cool idea to show you there. Before I do, I will mention that the reason that bishop d6 is not going to be so effective is that after something like bishop e2, like castles, if we just kind of play normal moves for black, I mean, white does have like some practical chances for sure, but Alexander Gelman has played this like in 5 games in Tile Tuesdays, and he's actually only scored 1 out of 5, which is obviously not such a great sign. It's kind of funny actually. Injury doesn't think it's that bad for black, but I do think that overall a position like this is just going to be very it's just going to be a lot easier for white to play. Like you can play a move like a5 as in Leon Levesque did against Gelman in the 2020 Tile Tuesday game. Also, move rook a2 is also just very healthy, just like b3, rook, bishop b2, and I mean I do think white is just probably slightly better in a position like this. I mean that's not even counting that white also could probably try and move like bishop d2 as well as a kind of interesting alternative, which it's sort of aimed against queen f6 because in the bishop b2 line, like black had some creative ideas where you could try to go for like some lines with g5 in certain positions. Um, okay, to be fair, it was more like this sort of thing. It was like very, very computerish. But basically, Bishop E2 is kind of aimed against some of those ideas as such. But anyway, I'm getting a bit off topic, but the point is that instead of Bishop D6, that now though we should play the move of G6, this is the novelty that I want to share, courtesy of Stockfish. And I mean, the point is that the bishop is just going to be very nice on this diagonal, but also compared to bishop e7 f6 idea I showed before. It's kind of nice to have that bit of luft for the king and, the bishop not having a good diagonal on d3 and such. And if they do play a4 like Levaik did, then you can just play knight a6 and just have some good squares to kind of latch onto here. And you can analyze it more deeply if you want to yourself. But yeah, at the end of the day, this is just not going to be not going to be a worse position for black in any sort of form. In fact, it might even be black who's the one who can maybe start thinking about an advantage if white is not careful here with like knight c5 and you're getting the pawn back. So with that, you can see that yeah, with g6, if white wants to try and set problems, it's probably not going to be with natural moves. But if they do play a disruptive move like, let's say, queen c2 or h4, h4 is kind of the easier one. We just go bishop g4, and that just shuts that down very quickly. But if they do play queen c2, I would probably just play queen e7. And yeah, there's different moves you can play. But the way the engine wants to do it is like b3, bishop f5, and which is very interesting to see that even though the move bishop g7 is obviously going to be like totally fine as well here with their structure getting very weakened. You can also even play it with bishop h6, just kind of keep more tension in the position. So something like this with like keeping d4 kind of in reserve is yeah also going to be quite fine for black. If you want to go a bit deeper, like there are some ideas like where you can go for f5, f4. Like again, I'm kind of putting this in more for those who kind of get the PGN file, but just to show a few different ways that the position can kind of play out. Like h4, yeah, just doesn't really have the desired effect either in a case like this. So anyway, with that, I'll kind of move to. I also will mention queen c3 d4. That's one other thing you might also explore in your own time if you want to, but that's more for like the theory nerds, to be fair, such as myself. So after d5, if they do play a move like g3, I think black can be pretty happy with this. Again, nearly all the games in the database by Alexander Gelman, because he's maybe a little bit of a pioneer of this knight to a6 move. And they say the first one to the wall always gets bloody. But after bishop e7, bishop to g2, yeah, he always played the move of castling. You could also start with bishop f6, but yeah, I think that in this case, so Gelman kind of played a lot of different moves. Like he played rook e8, bishop a6, bishop f5, bishop f6. I think of these moves, I do like the move of bishop f6 the best though, because it just is quite natural, I think, to not let white develop so easily. Like if they go queen c2, you just go knight e6, and you just have the obviously I meant to play knight e6, not bishop e6. But you just get this very typical kind of Benko Blumenfeld sort of play, like e4, you just go d4, and have a nice pass pawn to kind of work with here. And if they do play a move like e4 and try to sack the pawn like this, I still think black gets pretty good compensation anyway. You can play like this e3 move that's going to be a bit disruptive and just kind of make it hard for white to get their queenside developed and to make something of the extra pawn. So something like this is just like totally fine for black. Got lots of ideas and lots of piece play. A move like e4, yeah, it has been played a few times, and it is a little bit of a tricky move for black. Like for example, you don't want to just take on e4 because then you're going to run into problems with this fork. Instead, you're going to want to play the move of queen to e7. The engine does point out a couple of alternatives, but queen 7 is just the move that just makes the most sense. Just pin them like that. And yeah, there were a few different games, like a couple of email games and one over the board game. Like the email games where I was playing bishop e2, and the over the board game was between Lalif against Skytar. Actually, a very recent game, just in May of 2026, like in the recent Sardinia World Open tournament that Frederick Spano won recently. In that game, like Black played the move Bishop G4, but I think that like F6 or even Queen D7 is kind of a bit computerish. I feel like F6 is a human move that will give you just very decent player, like just take back the pawn and carp and such. So actually, maybe it's not so simple. In fact, it's a bit computerish this line, but White does actually have some fun ideas where I can like sack the piece and get this very like romantic style attack on the king. So actually probably Queen D7 is going to be the move to kind of play here to prepare like the short castling or Bishop D3, Bishop A6 and stuff. Anyway, it's getting a little bit into the weeds of it, but basically if they do play Bishop E2 instead, in that case, you could make an argument for d4 or queen e4, like they were both played in one correspondence game. Even though it looks less natural, I do think d4 might actually be a little bit more precise, just to kind of keep that e-file closed and sort of get that tempo against the knight. But basically, the game kind of just went with like queen e5, and initially the engine will say white's a little bit better, but it kind of as you go deeper, it sort of turns out that black does have like the piece play they need, and that black is basically fine. Like by the time they got to this point, it was sort of evident that the game like was going to like end in a draw, and the game was drawn some moves later. Still engine giving a small edge for white, but if you go a bit deeper with it, it will start just move toward equality. So that shows the picture of queen to d1. What if they play queen e4? I'll spend a bit less time on some of these other moves that are not as common, but you can sort of see, in this case, white usually plays it with bishop to g5 in mind, because e3, d5, is kind of giving you a sort of a better version of some other positions we've kind of seen elsewhere. Something like this is even an endgame actually is going to be quite decent for black, who's kind of have the pressure with the bishop down the long diagonal. Um, and if they do play bishop g5, which is what they normally do here as white. I mean, I think the endgame is just not in any way worse for black. Like you just have very active piece play with the rook coming in. And usually white plays bishop e2. Like this actually happened in like 5 games of Alexander Gelman, mostly in 2021, and white lost all of them. It's obviously not a good investment for white's point of view. And I mean they were just playing this bishop e2 mistake. That's what nearly all of his opponents rated between 2-100 to nearly 2-400 were playing in blitz. But I think what they were missing is just b3, rook b3 does just win a pawn, and white's getting completely destroyed in this case. Like here, you're even just able to go bishop c2, and then you'll even take a second pawn because of the pin. So these are sort of tactics that you can just like crush 2-100 grade players with pretty easily, because it's happened a lot of times with Gelman's games. I mean, white really should play like king d2 if they want to avoid trouble, but still black is obviously going to have like more than enough play in a position like this with pretty standard ideas like we've seen before. And if they do play queen to d2, that's the one other move I'll touch on. Like we just go d5, and this move of b3 was played in a couple of games. But I mean, I don't really see any major problems for black. Like bishop d6. If they go bishop b2, you can just castle, and I just don't really see why black should be worse. Like you have moves like d4 to just kind of allow you to equalize just very directly, with the idea that if they take the pawn like with the knight, they actually end up in a lot of hot water with the piece kind of being thrown at the king. And if they play bishop d4, you kind of just go bishop takes f3, and then you have like some tricky moves like it's a bit of a computerish line, but you basically can go like bishop h2 and just kind of liquidate where like it's just white's pawns might look a bit imposing, but you're going to kind of have enough counterplay against the king that you're not going to be in any danger objectively as black. So that's kind of the picture with queen d2 in this case. It's not interesting to see the engine kind of wants to go g3 for some reason, which is a little bit curious, but basically in this case the way they were played in correspondence in many years ago is they kind of played it with the move of just rook to e8. But I think in this case, rather than his bishop f5, maybe I would go for a move like bishop b7, and I think I would just be very patient, like h6, rook a6, queen a8, and I think that's going to be the way to kind of show compensation as black. So I think that completes the picture pretty well on knight f3, and it really leaves us with one other major move. And I mean, one reason I think this video has ended up being quite detailed is because of the fact that I have basically tried to actually cover like every single move in Mega Database from White's point of view. So it's going to be a very exhaustive coverage, just leaving no stone unturned. I remember that in the past, actually, Alexander Harlichman did a similar approach with his books, like opening for White according to Anand, and opening for White according to Kramnik, and opening for Black according to Karpov. Like he kind of really established himself as a top tier chess theoretician with these like multi-volume books of very deep analysis, and that was before the engines were really strong. Like it was really a lot of hard work, because he was also like trying to figure out, okay, where is the engine wrong about this position, and all that, kind of using his human understanding. But yeah, that's kind of a little bit what we're doing here as well, just with the Benko instead. So after e4, we're going to play the move of knight takes d5 in this case. Because if we play knight e4, like obviously this is very bad news to put ourselves in a pin like this. So make sure you don't do that. We're going to play knight e5. There is actually a choice. They can also play queen takes d5. This is also worth mentioning. However, after the move of knight c7, what you'll kind of notice if white plays queen e5 and knight e6 is that usually white's going to play the move of knight to f3, and it's actually just going to transpose what we were just kind of looking at a bit earlier with the knight f3 move order. So that's one reason why we'll be able to cover e4 quite a bit more succinctly. But also there is an alternative that is worth mentioning, and this is something I think I've covered. I've definitely covered it in different videos in the past. I'm not sure if I've covered it on this YouTube channel publicly, but there's this really inspirational game between Bluebaum against Horvath, which actually I remember now. Yeah, I covered it in like an opening course of mine earlier this year. That's like I record so many videos, I lose track times of which video I put where in a sense. But there was this very cool game Bluebaum against Horvath. I did cover in a course, but rather than referring to that, I'm just going to like just show you the key idea. So basically, Horvath played this move at Bishop A6, and I mean you probably know Bluebaum was the guy who qualified for the 2026 FIDE candidates, just by being very below 2700 FIDE. But yeah, this Bishop A6 Queen A5, it is a trick we have seen before, and when I was showing some of these ideas in different versions, like this game was the one I was kind of thinking of as the parallel. I mean, white should probably play the move 92, but even then, black's still going to have very good play in kind of multiple ways, like both Bishop E2 and Bishop B6 are going to be quite adequate for black. But after knight to F3, this just ends up being a bit of a mistake by Bluebaum because of the fact that the white king is stuck in the center. And after B3, and you can also start with knight C7, by the way, but in the game, Horvath played rook Fe8. And at this point, in order to not be just losing, white probably just has to bail out into a worse end game where black has various ways to win back the pawn and just have a very good position with the typical Benko pressure of attacking their weak queenside pawns. But instead of playing this worse position and being down a pawn, instead white played the move e5, and then well let's see if you can find it. What's the move that black should play in this position here? Also, I think another reason this video is kind of long is I didn't just stop at the what was actually played in practice, but I also made sure to cover the top engine lines as well, because that's often indicative of what you'll face in the future if you are playing a strong player. But the move at knight d4 is going to be the key here. And it's just all over. Like in the game, I actually just got checkmated with queen d6, queen e2, which was, yeah, not every day you see like a top 100 player in the world get mated in 18 moves as white, but with the Benko, it's possible. But the problem for white, though, is that they obviously can't castle through check or, castle into the danger zone here. But if they do play knight d4, they're just going to run in a rook e5, and, you just end up winning the queen. So that's kind of the reason why this is just lost for white. So yeah, that was kind of the inspirational game that I wanted to share with that. But I also do want to mention really quickly what happens if they don't play queen e5, just kind of for completeness sake. Because there were like a bunch of moves that were played, but I will be fairly brief in my coverage of them because they are a lot less common than queen e5 here. So after queen to d1, this actually is probably one of the better moves for white in the position, but after bishop b7 and d5, we are going to get very good play. It's kind of a very fun idea, actually, that after takes queen d5, that we can actually castle long here, as happened in a few of the Gelman games. I even had this actually against Vidic in a game, as it turned out, where those games continued with queen e4, queen b3, and now this c4 is a really nice trick that gave Gelman an advantage in these games, where there were like a few different moves he faced. Like he faced, it's so funny, he actually didn't face the move of queen c3, even though it's a move like kind of needs to play here in order not just to be worse. But like there are various moves like king bishop c5 or king b8, which both kind of have the same idea of preparing knight d5 without queen c4 being a check, so that you can get in tricks like bishop b4 and moves like queen e3 are going to be a very bodacious way to just get an absolutely crushing advantage. Just with the bishops just being an absolute menace in a position like this, just to show one way it can play out. Very nice little rook lift here by black. In any case, in this game he actually faced different moves. Like he faced mostly queen e3, but also queen a4. But queen a4 just has a problem that the king is just never really getting out of the center. So this was a game he played that Fidit played where I mean White really should have just lost this game. Like if Black now just plays a move queen c4 and rook h8 and going for bishop e2, bishop to f3. Like it's sort of cleared everything just kind of falls apart for White here. So yeah, even against like a very strong GM like this guy, right, G400, yeah, basically, could have just got a dead one position with this Queen C4 novelty. And yeah, if Queen E3 is played, which is a bit more common, yeah, just Bishop B4 is going to be the problem for White here. Like Bishop D2, you just take it. I mean, it's just a very sad position for White. Like castles, Rook E8, and you can sort of feel Black's pressure, like it's just kind of falling apart for White at this point, with the bishops kind of raking the board and all that here. So anyway, that's kind of why Queen D1's not that problematic of a move. I will say, for the sake of objectivity, Queen E2 is a better move for White in this position. But even in this worst case, I do still think that Black has pretty decent play for the pawn. Like your pieces are very active; it's very easy to kind of swing the pieces over. And so overall, yeah, I just don't really see any reason for Black to be concerned. Queen B3 was played in a couple of games, but if you know the move of Queen E7, it's really nothing to fear. Like if they play Queen E3 trying to avoid D5, well, you can still get it in anyway, like Bishop B7, and you can play D5 anyway if you want to just get very reliable play. And there's other moves well like G6 as well that if you do want to keep a bit more tension in the position, that also gives Black some good chances. But yeah, the choice is yours there. Queen H5, yeah, again, Queen E7. It's kind of a good theme to remember this Queen E7 and just attacking this pawn if they don't defend it properly. Queen G5 is a kind of interesting move, but I do think that with a move like Bishop to B7, like you don't really need to fear the endgame as such. Like you just go for D5, and Black is again just going to be very comfortable with the active piece play, and you're probably going to either get the pawn back or make their structure so bad that they're just not in. There's just nothing to fear whatsoever as Black. So that's kind of the picture on Queen D5. But what if they play E takes D5 instead? Well, in this case, you actually kind of have a couple of different options that are kind of interesting. But I do think that Knight B4 is a move I would probably favour over a move like Bishop to D6, which is a little bit more abstract. It's still going to be playable, but I just think that, yeah, I kind of want to play a little bit more directly. The move Bishop C4 is the move that you will usually see as Black. There are also some other moves like Knight F3 and A3 also do exist as well, and we will get to those in due course. But after Bishop C4, what do you think is going to be the move for Black to play in this position? Just out of curiosity. So at this point, I really like the move of Queen to E7. It's a really nice way to just disrupt White's attempts to coordinate. In fact, White has to play the move King F1 and lose to White's castle just to not be worse, because obviously Queen E2, Knight C2 is using the pin on the king, the queen, the king to our advantage. But if they do play Knight E2, the danger levels come from the move of Queen to E4, forking the bishop, the pawn, and Knight C2, and White's just not really able to cover it all at once, right? Bishop B3. Actually, in this position, it's probably even better to play the move Knight D3 rather than just getting back your pawn. Because with Knight D3, you just have this very long-term initiative with Bishop A6, and it's just really hard for White just to develop it from there. Yeah, my chess race started playing up on me like a little kid, but fortunately for us, the pause button exists, and yeah, saved me so many times in my life. But okay, going back to this one here, one usually plays the move of King to G1, but in that case, yeah, you can even just play Bishop to D6, and even though Gelman like lost a game from this position, I mean, it was a blitz game, and so that doesn't really tell so much. Like for example, he didn't just like take the free pawn on offer here for some reason, which would be way simpler than the move of castles that he played in his games, And also, Yeah, I mean, if White plays something else, like if they play Bishop E3, is what happened in another Gelman game. But yeah, again, like you can even just take the pawn and bring the knight this way. I think that's an easier approach than the way that the Gelman was kind of playing it, just focusing on development. I mean, the way it played still gives a pretty big advantage, of course, but if you see a free pawn, I'm inclined just to take it. So that explains why King F1 is going to be the move for White here. But in that case, yeah, we have a few good replies. I do think Queen E4 is a kind of cool novelty from Black's perspective. Like usually in practice, Black was playing the move of Bishop A6 instead. But I do think that that does give White. I mean, Black's still fine in this position as well. It's not the end of the world by any means, but I do think that White has a few more ideas to kind of work with. Bishop E7 is also possible, by the way, but Queen to E4, yeah, just kind of resolves the position very quickly. After Queen E2, yeah, I mean, in this case, I probably would just take and go Bishop A6. I think that, in this case, we're just very happy to trade the queens because the endgame is just generally good for black. And if they do try to hang on to their pawn with something like, let's say, knight to C3, well, then we can just go bishop to D6, and we're just going to have very typical compensation. Like we can, play bishop E5 and just have very good pressure against the pawns, and probably will get one of them back sooner rather than later. And also, yeah, if they do play, some other move like A3. I mean, we're already pinning that pawn to the rook, right? So you can even just like castle here if you want to, and just wait a move and then play knight D3, and getting the knight in their face is definitely going to make White's task of try and convert the extra pawn very very difficult from here. So this is to say that yeah, Black just has very good compensation, or in a position like this, like very fine play. So as you can see, there's more than one good option after King F1. The choice is kind of yours in terms of what type of position you kind of want in a sense. Also, if they do play a move that's not Bishop C4, I think Black does get equalized sort of fairly easily there as well. Like if they go King F Knight F3, I do think I would prefer to play Queen E7 and focus on the development over like getting greedy and taking the pawn, but kind of falling behind in development. And at this point, actually, there isn't a move I can also play a Bishop E3 that it's a novelty that is worth mentioning as well. But Rook Queen E4 is going to be a good reply. Like you can take back the pawn, and it turns out that Black is going to be in fine shape here as well. Yeah, get a bit of a case of hiccups. I don't know if rewatching like How to Train Your Dragon with my wife has anything to do with it. But yeah, at this point you can see how like after takes that you're not going to like open up the e file to your own king. You can just play solidly and maintain the balance with natural developments, kind of leveraging your long term trump cards in the sense of your better pawn structure. But again, the move bishop e2 is what you will see more often, and yeah, in the two games having the database, the move bishop e3 was played. And actually, here at this point, I would recommend playing the move of bishop takes e2 and not the move of queen to e4. Like queen 4 is just going to be a less efficient way to get your material back, because then you're going to have the problem king is going to be stuck in the center. Whereas by playing queen e2, yeah, you kind of set up that if they do play a move like king e2, well, now their king is stuck in the center, and you sort of got some nice little geometric motifs to really put their king in a very rough spot while still being able to castle ourselves. Whereas after queen e2, yeah, we are able just to get our pawn back, and you can sort of see the position's going to be a little bit dry from white's perspective. Like here, they kind of have to. Well, if they play fe3, like and just take without thinking, like you're already going to be a little bit better because you've got the Benko play without needing to even give up a pawn to get it as such. But on the other hand, if white does, play the very resourceful move of rook f to e1 here, which is the better move, well, then you can just sort of bail out into an endgame where white is going to have a reasonable enough position, but yeah, black is not really going to be in any sort of realistic danger either. Like you've got the strong center to work with, and it's just a position at the end of the day, just normal sort of endgame. And if they play a3, well, I mean they're not even threatening to take the knight as we've discussed before. So I will mention the novelty of bishop e7 is quite a good reply, where you just focus 5 here, and you already know bishop c4, queen e7 ideas, and And if white does play it a little bit more enterprisingly with something like knight to f3 and trying to get the lead in development. Yeah, I mean there's a few good replies, but I do think I like the move of knight b6 and just keeping it simple, just developing, and again you've got the imbalance in the structure that will give you quite good scope to play for the win here. Yeah, there's also the move of queen e7 is also possible. I think knight b6 is just a little bit more harmonious in my humble opinion. But again, the choice is yours. Like both options will equalize. So with that, that does kind of cover the picture of e4. And yeah, I mean, other moves I think are just going to be less critical in general. Like if they play, just going to find my bearings for the different moves. Like if they play, let's say, knight f6, e3, or g3. Like knight f6 already feels like a little bit of a concession and just helping out queen get more active. Like say knight f3, knight b4. Like it's pretty clear that black is just not having any problems whatsoever here once they get back the pawn and catch up in development like like so. Yeah, it's like d6 and you can just sit on your bishop pair forever. Or if they do play a move like a3, that's just going to end up in very hot water. After queen f5 has happened in a Chishan-Chuk Gelman game from I'm assuming Tile Tuesday. So knight f6 is just not really something to fear, and these moves like e3 I just feel like kind of give. So e3 is actually a move that does score well for white in the database, so it is probably a good one to touch on. But I think bishop b7 is just a pretty good reply here. We can just go take, take, and they'll usually play the move of knight to f3 in this position. Because like bishop b5, we can just play like queen to d8 and just be very solid, and moves like bishop d2, yeah, also kind of run into like knight b4 sort of counterplay. And those are both novelties, by the way, what I just showed you there. So you are most welcome. But after knight f3, the way I would play it as black is, you kind of have two options here. You can either play bishop e7, and it's going to kind of transpose into some other positions as such. With black kind of playing bishop to be, it will actually transpose into a line of like 5 e3, e6. So that's kind of what it would transpose into like bishop e7. But there's a little bit of a deep line. Like I realized that if I cover like that line as well, E3 6, like the video is going to be like over 4 hours long probably, and even I have my limits as to how much I can record in one sitting. But after knight f3, if you do want something that's less theoretical, we'll say bishop f3 is I think a very decent novelty. Before I talk about it, actually, I will just enter that e3 line because I do think it's for those who are like who end up buying the PG, and I think it's going to be good to kind of see like the to see the transposition as such. So it basically happens with this sort of thing. Like if white plays b takes a6 in like in this position, that's going to be the transposition to like the that earlier line from before. Of course, it's true white does have other moves of like playing bishop e2 and waiting for black to take them, but again, that's going to be a better topic for a separate video, just because we really dive deep into this e6 move as discussed. So going back to where we kind of were, and showing you that that novelty of bishop takes f3 here. Well, in this case, white probably is going to play queen f3 and trade the queens, because gf3 just kind of gives you a very easy player like castles knight b4, and like just practically speaking, it's going to be kind of hard for white to ever find like complete safety for the king. Like to keep their king safe, they probably would need to go something like bishop to g2 and kind of have the bishop defend the king like that. But then you also just kind of get your pawn back very easily. It's like a position like this is. Like the only negative thing I can really say about it is a little bit kind of drawish if the pawns just keep getting hoovered off. But I mean, even then, you do still have like the opposite colored bishops to kind of play for a win. And now I think of it as well, like rook c5 actually can also run into. I mean, it probably is still going to be a bit of a dry position, but black is kind of the one who I was going to say like black is the one who could probably press in a position like this, but it probably is just equal to be fair. So yeah, bishop f3 I will admit is probably more of a way just to play for like very steady equality, but it is like very reliable in doing so, and it also saves us a lot of like work, like having to learn like a lot of deep fury for like a rare sideline. So that's also kind of nice for us. Like say we go rook b1, rook a2. Yeah, white has the bishop pair, but we don't really have any major weaknesses, and their structure is a little bit worse than ours. So all in all, yeah, I think black is just totally fine in this case. We've some pretty natural kind of moves to follow. So if they play g3, yeah, that's not a move I'm too concerned about really. You can take, and I will say rook a7 is kind of an interesting way to try and take advantage of this sort of block diagonal. One usually will play bishop g2, and you'll usually get a position like this where yeah, you can just trade the queens, just have that very typical kind of Benko compensation with the with the very active pieces like knight b4 and and all this sort of thing. And if white does play knight f3 instead, trying to keep the tension, then yeah, you just play knight b4. You can get your pawn back in different ways, but I kind of like going for knight c2 personally. And yeah, I mean, a position like this is, I think, just going to be quite fine for black. The engine's kind of saying you can even go like knight to b4 and like take the pawn back this way. It's kind of saying a little bit of a trap, like if a3, you can kind of go bishop e4, and yeah, there's sort of this fun idea where you can sort of like trap their rook in, or well, they sort of have to play b3, and there's this kind of equality. So anyway, that's a little bit of a diversion, but that does show like how to deal with some of these sidelines. And yeah, I mean, a move like I will also point out by the way, like a move like bishop g5 just doesn't work because just go d4, and the attempt to try and be a creative genius just kind of fails here as white. So okay, that really leaves us with one other major battleground. And it hasn't been played in many games overall, but it is something that has become a little bit more popular of late. And that is the move of d takes e6. Actually, before I get to d6, I will mention there are a couple of other moves that kind of have been played a little bit, like moves like a7 and bishop g5 and e4, and I'll cover them now just because we can kind of get them out of the way really quickly. But you'll kind of see this is kind of just a worse version for white of some of the other positions, because the fact that you haven't had to take back the pawn at some point just gives you a lot of freedom to to just play it other ways. Like you can just go d5 and just kind of play like just very normal kind of moves, and just be fine. So a7, yeah, you're either going to face, and it's not really anywhere near as much of a problem as it was after g6 as such. Bishop g5, yeah, you can just take the pawn. I mean, it's just not going to be any kind of problem. Like, you already have to find the move of like knight c3 to not have a bad position. But you just go d4, and like again, my attempt to try to be a creative genius is kind of backfiring because we've got tricks like c4 that allow us to threaten bishop b4 and kind of take the initiative here. So that's why I don't really see bishop g5. And e4 I'm only mentioning because it was played by Georgina in a relatively recent game in Prague Challengers. But I feel like it is a little bit of a bluff because after 94, I don't entirely see, I guess, the point of white's play. Because you've got this queen a5 check in a lot of positions that are just really, really annoying. And the engine's saying to play like knight c3, like this probably was Zhu's idea, but after takes, I mean, black has got equal material, and it is even like queen f6 that you can play if you want to try and punish their play and just grab their pawns, but also something like bishop to e7 is obviously going to be pretty fine as well for black. So yeah, e4 is like very clear, like just a one game kind of bluff by in this case. But just mentioning it just in case someone's inspired by that. In any case, going to the sort of final key branch of this video with the move of d takes e6. So after f takes e6, there is actually a little bit of a choice for white here, where knight c3 is not the only move, but they can also play moves like e3 and g3, and if I enough actually to move a knight f3 will actually transpose into the Blumenfeld gambit lines. If white plays like b takes a6 here, it'll transpose into the Blumenfeld territory. It's kind of interesting to see how like Blumenfeld coded this system is. It is worth pointing out by the way, like b6 isn't really considered the most critical. Like the move e3 is sort of thought to be the way in which white should fight for a small edge here. But obviously, with our kind of Benko move order, we, sort of avoided that a little bit. I'm going to start with the move of knight to c3 first. Yeah, there are a couple of other moves I can also play, like the move of e4, yeah, which also kind of exists, even though it's not very good. But yeah, we'll leave it, make sure to cover that. I'm going to start with the move knight c3, and I'm going to like take my time a little with this one because there are definitely a lot of transpositions that can arise in the different lines. By the end, you'll feel pretty comfortable with the arising middle games, and like I said, if you decide to later learn that Blumenfeld is called a companion to Benko, then this work we're doing here is going to make that transition a lot easier to, know how to play like those types of positions well also. And I mean, learning how to play like these different positions is like very good for your chess development in general. Like, to not just try to play the exact same way every time, but see how some of these gambit positions play out. So at this point, I would advocate for the move of bishop takes a6 for black is the way I think that the black should play it. Because if you play d5, what I do have to watch out for is the move of e4. This is actually going to be a very annoying move. Feel like going off randomly just then, but yeah, it's something that was disrupting my focus a little bit. So, but yeah, this e4, you can sort of see the idea that black doesn't really want to take back the pawn because then the structure is just going to be absolutely disgusting here. But up to d4, white has this trick of like, well, e5 is kind of usually the way that the white plays in like the Blumenfeld version with the knight on f3 and such. But there are also even some other good moves as well, like for example, knight to b5 even is actually going to be kind of annoying for black here. So if you play like knight takes e6, white can just play like bishop to c4, and I'm not going to go deep into the weeds of it, but it turns out that white has a really strong initiative, and the fact that black's king is a bit weak and does become quite a big problem if white is able to take the initiative, which is why we want to be the ones taking the initiative instead, and so that kind of fits in with our bishop takes a6 move in this position. Well, it does normally play g3, but I will also a bit later in the video also touch on a couple of other moves just to kind of make sure that our bases are covered. So, but g3, yeah, that's a move you can really expect to see the majority of the time. And at that point, there's sort of a couple of different ways black can play, but it's often going to just transpose to the same kind of position. So I do think that the move d5 is the move order that I'm going to advocate for here. Like a lot of the times, you're basically going to get this position just via different orders of moves, like bishop to d6, and nowadays, interestingly enough, actually knight h3 is kind of the way that white normally plays it more so than putting the knight on f3. But just with the idea of kind of trying to bring the knight in and or supporting the bishop and try to get some pressure that way. But yeah, this is a position that you can definitely expect to see quite a bit in your times when playing the Benko Gambit with e6 as black. And like I said before, it can also get from Blumenfeld, so if you play that way, you'll see it even more often. But yeah, this one really is kind of the position after bishop f4 is really the key position of the whole variation as such. And I will also like put in a couple of terms like just to make sure that I kind of remember to get to them, and it'll also include like a couple of human novelties that like maybe aren't in a database, but the sort of thing you might see like an average 2,000 player play if they just don't really know what they're doing. But bishop f4, yeah, really is kind of the bigger question, and I've sort of explored a few different ideas fairly briefly. Like it's sort of the complexity of positioning can be described fairly well by the fact that in pretty much every time I've checked this position or on each move as I go down the line, the engine ends up recommending a different move for black here. Now, the good news is it means that we have several quite playable options for black, and there's different ways to play to try to make it work. But I do have to admit that white does also have pretty decent chance of an advantage here. And so that's kind of like the trade-off you make with playing in this sort of gambit that, yeah, if white plays perfectly, they probably get a small edge, but we can still make it work. The opposition is still fundamentally sound. And the direction I think I'm going to focus on, also just based on kind of the engine sort of liking it, but also Nicholas Fyodorou beating Casper Purin with it in the game, is going to be this move of h6. And actually, they played it in an over the board game as it turned out, so that makes it kind of even more valuable in a way. So also there will be a few other moves I will cover. Like I'm just going to just put like a few of the different options in the notes, just so I kind of remember to sort of address them. I know it's going to seem like a lot of variations, but it will make sense by the time we kind of get to the end. Again, it's just following this approach, like not just looking at one move, but kind of seeing, okay, what happens after the other move, so that we can see kind of what plans we can kind of cross over into our recommended optimal lines. And also means if you do forget the Fury, you'll still come up with a pretty good move over the board if you know like a few good ways to play it, not just one. But let's focus on the move h6 first. And again, this is a position I'm going to return to because the way that pure and played of knight d5 and playing it tricky like this is not the only move for white, of course. Like there are moves like rook e1 was played by the Azeri GM Suleimanov in a actually not, I'm thinking of a different one. I think he's the Kazakh GM Suleimanov in the in a recent game, even 2026. Also, there are a couple other moves like rook to c1 or a4. Or what if they just just take because they didn't learn to take as a mistake. So there's like a lot of different ideas like that, which we will return to. But I feel like it's going to be the most fun if I just show you the game as kind of inspiration for how Fyodor, who's one of the big heroes of E6, by the way, on move 5, has really been making this work even against some quite strong players lately. Like he really has revitalized the whole Benko in that sense. So the idea of knight d5 is basically that if black takes with a pawn, that white is going to then be able to take one of these two pieces and just have an advantage in a position like this. Like three pawns is a little bit too much. Like probably has compensation for two pawns, but not for three pawns yet. To give an idea. So for that reason, black goes knight d5 and plays a little bit of a surprising move of knight to d4. Kind of realizing that if white does take on a8, they actually end up in very hot water with the move of knight takes e2 here. I mean, you could also play knight e2 first. Maybe that's a little bit more natural way to show it. But yeah, basically this position is going to be very, very strong for black because of that's not the only move, by the way, but the one that gives black just a massive advantage is going to be this knight d4 with the idea that if they do take you end up just getting this decisive attack or this very strong attack on the king. Obviously, Fyodor had prepared this beforehand. But yeah, you can see here how like after queen a6, if you're hitting the bishop, you're also threatening knight e2. And white's basically forces to kind of give up the piece and just have a much worse position because if they do try to keep the extra piece alive, they end up running into knight e2, king g2, and now this move of queen b7 basically just wins because there's just no way out of the discovered check from the rook. Like wherever the queen goes, we're just going to be able to take it. Like for example, queen e2, rook e3, and you can see at the end they lose their rook to the fork. So it's an advanced tactics. That's why I kind of took my time with it. But that's basically the preparation that Fyodor had done for this game. And bishop takes e6, yeah, is the move that it was played, and at this point, white's best option probably is to play bishop d6, where I'm not sure if Purin was more concerned about like rook f5 and the sort of attack black gets with knight f d4 after that. It is obviously giving black very good compensation, and the fact that the machine is already just wanting to just give back the exchange just to to bail out on an endgame is obviously kind of a speaks to the extent of black's dynamic potential. Black, by the way, is still doing fine in this position. Like you probably have to be slightly precise, but you are going to be able to equalize if if you know what you're doing. So instead of this, like maybe this is what Purin didn't like, because I'm guessing he probably wasn't too concerned about like bishop e2 and this sort of thing. But after queen d5 instead, that did end up being a little bit of a mistake because it did allow black to keep the queens on the board and just have a very strong attack on the light squares. Like you really feel with the opposite colored bishop, like just how this bishop on the dark squares is just useless for defending off the light squared play. Obviously, the 9 is also very, very misplaced in a wide open position like this. White's best option is probably just to give back the pawn, but try to stop moves like knight d4. I mean, black is still doing very well, of course, but in the game, rook fe1, black later in knight d4. I do think there's even ways to improve it as black, like rook fd8 and stuff, but knight d4 also was putting white really under a lot of pressure. Again, you have to find some very computerish moves like bishop e5 just not to end up in a very, very bad position. Where after the more natural queen c5, like it turned out that even though white has 3 pawns for the exchange here. The weak light squares are really a perennial problem for whites, and with bishop f3, black just had a very big advantage. Like the way the game concluded, white was yeah trying to get some sort of counterplay, kind of realizing that just letting black continue to attack is not going to be so nice for white evidently. But instead after queen d6, black was able to just neutralize the attack, and like even having 5 pawns for the rook is not really going to save white here when the king is basically out of the game for the rest of the game due to our dominant bishop. And after queen g5 instead, yeah, black just played king f7. Turns out, yeah, if you play queen f4, black will just go king to g6, and there's just no good check for the queen there, whereas we do have a mating attack coming. So after rook c1, yeah, the game just ended like this, where there's this funny little king walk, this very nice rook a5 pin, and then yeah, after a couple of moves, Purin just resigned because if you do play queen f4, there's a really cool move for black now of rook takes g4, where they can't take the rook because of queen h1 mate, but otherwise you just win the queen. So that's how the game would have ended, if Purin didn't resign first. But hopefully, yeah, this example here kind of shows you really what we're aiming for when we play the Blumenfeld Gambit. I think it's just absolutely a model game from Black's point of view. I think from this you can also really see why I do like include a lot of those model games annotated in the in the Patreon files I'm selling in the description and in the pinned comment, because that's really what's going to give you the mastery of the positions. Like, yeah, you see one game like this is going to give you like a lot of inspiration, a lot of confidence, which is definitely important as well for playing an opening, as Rishi and I like to say in the past. So, the main thing is that you feel confident in the opening even more so than maybe necessarily equalize. But also, yeah, that sort of mastery does come from like putting those reps in, like seeing, 20, 30, 50, 60 games like this one that we just saw. But at least, it gives you a little taste of how it plays out. Now, the move of rook e1 is definitely an alternative, and I think 95 is the way that black should play. So Suleimanov played this move of queen to c2 in a game, which, yeah, I feel like it's probably not the most critical. Like, you can just play rook b8, and I mean, there's an undersort position where you can kind of like analyze it totally exhaustively. Like, white just has so many reasonable moves on each turn, but one idea I kind of want to mention is that the move of c4 is often going to be a move you'll see in the middle game, just kind of fix this pawn on b2. It also takes a lot of the sting out of e4 if you're able to kind of like have these connected passes. But yeah, also like if they play b3, c4 is a nice way just to not let them consolidate and just kind of have that very active piece play on the queen side. So it's definitely a kind of idea that's good to have in the arsenal for understanding these sorts of middle games. I think a more critical approach fight probably is to play rook c1 instead, which is a new move here. And then you have a choice. Like you can go rook b8 and queen c7. Like this is the way that the engine wants to play it, which it's sort of going to be connected in some cases with playing a move like c4, but also kind of sort of steadily building up position. Like where we go rook c8, rook e8, or rook d8 kind of is going to depend on what white does as well. Like it makes sense you'll probably go rook e8 more if you want to defend e6. But overall, yeah, I do think black has pretty reasonable play here. Like I don't really see any massive problems. Like white's probably a little bit better, but an endgame like this, for example, is like one that you should be able to draw without too much difficulty. And obviously, like there's plenty of alternatives as well. Like you're not forced to play rook fd8 here, and you're also in this position. You could also play move like rook c8 and queen b6 as well. Which I think if you're like in a must-win game, this is probably the approach I would take. Like just playing the pieces a little bit more actively and kind of waiting for a right moment to play c4. I do also notice like there are some positions where the engine even kind of thinks g5 is kind of interesting. I do feel like it could be a little bit risky to open up the king, so that's kind of why I'm suggesting more the piece play, and like c4 on the queen side is more the approach I'm advocating here. So still, it is a lot you can explore in your own time. Like obviously you could go much deeper into these positions, but I think that this gives a picture of like how the middle games can typically play out. And also like the worst case, even if white finds the best moves, you still have pretty decent compensation. After rook c1, and we're going to play 95 again. I just like this move quite a lot. If you do want an alternative, I will say rook b8 is kind of interesting as well. Where like if b3, there's the move in 97, we can kind of sort of prepare a move like e5 by defending this pawn. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic approach that it can also be investigated. But 95, I feel like, is probably going to be the most reliable move here. And obviously, if they play rook e1, it's going to transpose to what we were just looking at. So that makes it easy enough. It's also another reason I can't recommend 95. Like, it's easy to remember to just play it each time. If they play queen to c2 or b3, those are two moves that sort of make sense to me in general, because I do think that knight a4 just kind of leaves knight a little bit out on a limb after c4. But yeah, if they play queen c2, for example, again, you just kind of have a lot of playable moves. Like you can go rook b8, you can put the queen on e8, and have this sort of extra mobility for the queen for some attacking chances. You could also just put the queen on e7 as well. Although I think e7 probably not as keen on personally, but it is also a possibility. So yeah, let's put these moves like both exclamation mark just so people who have the Patreon file know about like rewatching the video because we obviously are covering a lot of material here. But yeah, if they play b3 instead, I mean, usually with b3 it is kind of connected with playing a move like knight a4 at some point, and so I do think that putting the rook on c8 will just make a lot of sense there. It allows you to meet knight a4 with a move like c4 or knight of d7. It just really negates that pressure against the c5 pawn very conveniently. Yeah, I mean, if they play a4, there's going to be various fine moves for black. Like you can play queen b6. You can even play rook b8 actually, because now knight a4 isn't possible anymore. So it's just a nice way to kind of use the weakening move against them. So there's different ideas like that you can play in order to try to outplay the opponent from here. Just a very interesting position in general. And yeah, if they play a4, I would probably just go rook f7 is kind of the way that the sort of the engine kind of wants to play it. But if you play like 95, it's obviously going to be totally fine as well. Like the idea of rook f7 is kind of to tuck away the bishop so that you can end up kind of running with the pawns like with e5 and this in some later positions. So I know that obviously can set why it's a pretty difficult question, something like that. So anyhow, with that, obviously, yeah, only two games we played and we explored it in quite a lot of depth, but I think it gives you a picture of what that sort of super grandmaster preparation looks like, where it's sort of like the starting point of the analysis rather than the end point when you were, when you were a professional. In any case, there are some other alternatives, like I said, like 95 is also possible here. But the reason I like h6 first is that the move knight g5 is, I think, going to be a little bit annoying here. Like, there are a couple of correspondence games in 2025 where black did hold the draw from this position. So it's definitely still fine as such. Like in those games, like in one game, black played h6 and another black played rook b8, and like both of them ended in a draw. But I do think I like h6 a little bit better in that case, where you kind of get you get a position like this where you end up. You sort of it feels like you are kind of playing for a draw a little bit when you play like bishop c3, and I know that might seem like a bit of a weird thing to sort of say, but just as a piece of kind of simplifying quite quickly here. So that's kind of why I sort of make that observation. Okay, I'm just entering a few things just for the Patreon file. But this is kind of the reason why I decided to recommend h6. I just think it keeps a lot more tension in the position than the move 95 does. And it also has novelties like a4 they can play to try to fight for an advantage, like trying to get knight b5 and that sort of blockade like we saw in the Benko lines before, like in the bishop a6 lines as it were. So with that, yeah, that's kind of why I'm not the biggest fan of 95 in this exact position, but I want to play it after h6. Queen e7 does anticipate knight g5, but I just think that in a position like this one, ideas like e4 are just going to be quite annoying. And for rook 88, I just feel like the pawn on ac5 is going to be a little bit of a weakness. And I mean, if you're playing a move like rook a8, it's already kind of a sign here that's not really ideal from a practical point of view. Maybe like king h8, yeah, as well. Like you're just kind of leaving white a little bit too fast at e4. Bishop f4 obviously just kind of helps the knight just to activate. That's not really what we want to do either. Like we want to keep that tension and keep the knight on a passive square. Because like if they take us, it's obviously a much better version. When we're able to get the queen active and to sort of neutralize the move of knight f4. Well, okay, it's true the pawn is kind of under fire here. But we'll be able to kind of like go for like a pawn storm if they do play knight f4 later, like this kind of thing. Obviously, rook b8, it's kind of just use it just as an example move because white can also just play a move like a move like queen to d2. But I do think rook b8 is kind of an interesting alternative. Like you can go knight e5, and I think you can sort of make this work as black. Or if they go b3, we can go back to h6 and some of the ideas that we were seeing a little bit earlier, like knight e5 and c4, or knight e7 and preparing e5. There's a couple of ways to play it. But rook b8, yeah, kind of probably the most interesting move of the alternatives. And it is also a novelty, by the way, just so you know. But I will mark h6s with a little exclam. Now, I did also point out that there are some alternatives that White could play in this position. I mainly focus on bishop f4 because it is the move that is the most critical according to the computer, whereas with the other moves, I think it's going to be easier for us to be able to prove a full compensation for the material. So the move that you'll see the most often, other than bishop f4, is the move of knight to f4. And actually, this is a way that Blue Bar played in a bunch of games recently. Like he scored a very nice 3.5 out of 4 in blitz from this position. However, none of his opponents played the move queen e8, which is a novelty in this case. And then it sort of actually shows like part of what I like about Blue Bar's approach. Like this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think one of the reasons he does so well with d4 is he kind of finds his own weapon to like not the top line of the engine, but just practically kind of annoying that more often his opponents play moves like bishop c8 or queen e7. They're just going to be very passive. By the way, the problem with moves like bishop c8 is that you do run into the move of knight takes d5, which I did actually cover in a video actually, like in a paid course of mine. But it turns out, yeah, that this is just going to win too much material for white. So by playing queen e8, you might be wondering, well, why are we playing this? Well, it's so that knight d5 is not going to be a problem because we've ensured that the knight is covered. Now, to be fair, this position actually did come up in a game by Reza Mahdavi, the very promising Iranian blitz player on chess.com, against a 2-3-50. And like in that game, I played the move of b3, like a little bit of a limp kind of move. And I won't go through the full game because it was just a 3-minute game, but I do think that the move of rook d8 is just a kind of healthy approach to play here. Like if they go bishop b2, you're just going to like take and they're just going to have a really hard time with their king safety after this. But if they do play a little bit more sensibly, like say they play knight to d3, for example, well, it kind of opens the door for our queen to come in the attack. Like we can go knight d4, and we're just going to have a really great energy of our pieces. That it does give black an advantage in a position like this. So knight f4, yeah, just not really that much of a scary move. Rook e1 was played in one game, but yeah, plays were not so high level to be fair at the time the game was played. Actually, the flag was by Charlie, so yeah, like 2 500 player, to be fair. But I think yeah, h6 like a fairly easy improvement over Vice Charlie's move of queen to e8, which yeah just doesn't quite have the desired effect. Because then you can't keep the tension as well. Whereas with h6, you're just not as concerned about bishop f4. Like it kind of transfers to what we were just looking at. And I mean, if they play e4, you just go d4, and like that just very heavily backfires for white when we have such a monster center in there. Their knights are complete and bishops, like all their pieces completely out of play in a position like this one. So, so that's yeah, showing rook e1 isn't that effective a move at the end of the day. If bishop g5, I would probably just play like rook b8 or rook c8. I think both moves are going to be fine. If white does try to get tricky with tactics like takes and bishop d5 or knight d5, yeah, I think that the black does get pretty decent play. Like, for example, this is obviously going to be a bit nasty for for white's king on here. But if they do play knight e4, yeah, you also have like knight to b4 where you're sort of able to kind of get back some of your material and sort of have good play for the remaining pawns after that. So that's going to be all well and fine for black. And if they play a quiet move like b3, yeah, I'd probably just go h6 and bishop b2. Rook c8, I mean, your plan's just going to be to go like d4 and just push in the center. That's going to be how you get really strong players black in a case like this. So with that, yeah, just checking if there are any other moves. Like they could start with bishop f4, but after knight c6, they're almost certainly going to castle short anyway. And you're delaying it's only really probably just going to give black extra options, if anything. So, yeah, it's not really going to have any independent value if they do play bishop f4 and then castles, which has also been played a bit in correspondence. But if white does play knight f3, it's just only going to give white a much less pressure in comparison after castles. Yeah, this actually does transpose after castles to a position that actually arises from a lot more games from the Blumenfeld counter gambit, but it's sort of the way it would arise in this case after the move of knight to c6 would be from. I mean, it could probably rise from a few different move orders to be fair, but it'd kind of be from something like, let's say, if white plays g3 in a position like this, and we kind of just play like the natural moves for both sides here. So I'm just kind of checking to make sure I get my bearings, but it basically would be to say if black plays d5 and then in this position instead of white, yeah, like going for the kill, yeah, just play something like that. It's yeah, this I think is going to be like the transposition will kind of look like from a Blumenfeld move order as such. Yeah, we confirm it is indeed the same position. So white does have a few different options, and yeah, this is going to go a little bit deep, but I will try to like keep it to a reasonable length. But basically, like the main options here are going to be like bishop g5 and also other moves like rook to e1 and also every now and then they play a move like b3 or knight g5. So but we're mainly going to focus on these two moves, which are sort of connected with a similar idea if you're trying to fight on the light squares and not just let black have a free ride in the center of the board, as it were. After bishop to g5 and h6, white's idea is to take the knight, and okay, we have the bishop pair as well as the center, so it makes sense that white will most likely want to do something about that. It's kind of interesting to see that actually rook c1 is the move that has been played the most often in practice. And actually does score fairly well for white, even though I don't think that's necessarily because of the objective aspects of position. But the move knight d5 is kind of the more obvious question, and that's where I'm going to sort of start because yeah, what if white just takes the material, as it were. But this is one where actually black has scored a very nice 3 out of 3 in the database after bishop takes e2. Clearly, we're threatening the rook, we're threatening the knight, so we are getting our material back here. Probably white's best option is going to be just to play a move like knight to h4 here, because if white does play rook e1, for example, like you can just take it, and you can sort of see that the white king is just going to be way too exposed in a position like this with rook d2 to follow. And so really knight h4 is kind of the move white needs to play to be okay here. I mean, white does have compensation here, no doubt about it. But yeah, I think in a position like this, after a precise move of g5, a new move for us, by the way, well, then we just go into this line, and in the end, it just comes to equality. Like there's different ways it can play out, but yeah, in the end of the day, it will just be most likely a draw. I mean, you can play on with like rook a8 or f8 or rook a2 or other moves if you want to, but yeah, that's a way to keep the game going if you're in a must-win game. But theoretically, we can say knight d5 is just not causing any problems at all for the second player. I mean, with like rook c1, like I said, is one that scores quite well for white. There was some games like Bologan Nisipianu was like one game where instead of playing move knight d4, which is going to be my recommendation, instead you know Nisipianu played the move king h8, which I mean to be fair is also totally fine here. Like black is certainly doing pretty well in this case too. But like the move of rook ac8 was like a little bit yeah, it's okay. So like after a4, kind of already like went back with rook b8, and I mean even here like lost the game wasn't really necessary to fold the opening, but I think still the sequence here from this Balkan Spionic game does show kind of the problem for black, like the light squares are going to be a bit weak, and my suggestion of like either playing knight d4, like either here or playing it in just directly is going to just avoid that problem. If they play a4, you've also got moves like bishop e2, kind of allow you to to get back the pawn, but we don't have the same light square problems that this piano did in his game. And after c takes d4, knight a4, I mean, the knight just looks very weirdly placed here, and I think if you just go queen e5 and just put the pressure on them, like h5, h4, I do think it's a bit of an unpleasant position for white to defend. Because you've got like this very chunky center to go about bishops, and white does have some sort of very clear problems to work through here. So that would be my suggestion, like this knight d4, and that will, yeah, solve all your problems. If they do play 91 as Kamsky did in the game, like that just opens the door for this kind of attack. It's absolutely nothing that I can really do about it, to be honest. At least nothing good they can do about it. Because like h4 is just, yeah, open the floodgates to their own king in a sense. So, yeah, no, one just not a really good move by Kamsky in that game, even though he ended up winning it. So with that, we can go to the move of rook to e1 instead, which, yeah, does have some clear ideas of like e4 and try and get e5 for. So it makes sense that we should handle it with some care, right? In this case, I think the move of queen c7 is the one I probably like the best here. C4 is also an alternative you might like to explore. It kind of just takes a lot of the sting out of e4 when you can kind of hit with bishop c5 and this sort of thing. So that does have some merit also, but white also is not forced to play the move of e4 either. Like they can also go bishop e3 and play a bit more patiently, of course. So for that reason, I'm going to sort of lean more towards queen c7 as maybe a little bit more of a pointed choice, perhaps. But yeah, like both moves should really be fine, I think. Then yeah, a few different moves that White's kind of gone for, like knight g5 and bishop g5 and bishop h3 from here. But if knight g5, yeah, just go rook e8, knight d8, and that will just defend your pawn quite nicely. Something like this is, for example, is just clearly going to be quite adequate for black, where we can swing the queen over, we can tuck the bishop away if needed. And yeah, overall, I just think black has just very full compensation with some white's pieces also not really fully in the fray just yet. If they go bishop to g5, yeah, I would just go knight g4, just don't let them trade the knight, and I'll keep, I think, some nice dynamism in our position here. One could go deeper, but yeah, knight g4 already is actually, it's not technically not a novelty because there was one game where white went bishop h3, but yeah, we're not really concerned about bishop g4, of course, and white also just kind of played some rather careless moves that just gave black the play they wanted. So, and if bishop h3, yeah, you can just go like rook e8, and well, I mean they can also play a move like a4 again, but overall, yeah, I think after like h6, I will say this is probably one of the better options for white to be fair, but I think even here black is still going to get quite reasonable counterplay just with the very active piece play. Like white's probably slightly better, but I think we can still make it work as black with our pieces. So, but the arbitrary is admittedly probably one of the better options for white. So, with that, yeah, rookie one, it is, I think, the move that white should play if they want to fight for an advantage. And other moves, yeah, is going to make our life, I think, a lot easier by contrast, like b3, queen e8, for example. You can sort of see the attempts to try to get pressure on the pawn just don't really do that much. Like our attack is just going to be faster here in a sense. And if they play like knight g5, yeah, just queen d7, and again, it's not so obvious to me what White really achieved from playing these moves in a way. And yeah, a4 just like a4 is not that terrible of a move, but I do think that it does kind of open the door for play down this file. Like even if something direct like d4 is also possible, as well as a quieter approach like queen b6 and teeing up more for play in the center. But there's various ways for black to be fine here. So that, yeah, I think shows the picture pretty well if they play knight f3, which I do think that if you're playing plays below 2000, you might face knight f3 a little bit more than knight to h3, so that's why I kind of covered a few different ways that position can play out in a sense. Now, if we go back, yeah, I mean, if they play knight h3, they're just going to play like, if they do play knight g5, this is something they can try to do. Like it's already a novelty knight g5, but yeah, I mean, bishop h3, we can go bishop c8, and I feel like actually instead of bishop c8, there's actually also the move knight c6. It's really quite interesting as well, where you sort of sack the pawn, but you do end up getting pretty nice play with d4. Like that is you go bishop c4, and they kind of end up having the sacrifice material because like if they played like knight g5, they run into rook a4 and these sort of mate ideas. So there's tricks like that can definitely trip up someone in a game. But even if they do play it correctly, like you still have a fine position here as black. Like it's one way, yeah, maybe white's got some small edge, but I think that yeah, it's not worse than anything else you get in a Blumenfeld, normally speaking. Um, yeah, it's somewhere between slightly better and equal would be my evaluation. But yeah, the bishop c8 is probably the most solid move. You could just keep yourself safe. They're probably going to like bring the bishop back anyway, and you can kind of just go ahead with some normal plans like we've kind of looked at before. So overall, not too concerned about knight h3, but it is the sort of move I might play as white just to get the opponent out of book and try to get some fresh positions. But it turns out we're even ready for that as it happens. I mean, you could also start with knight c6 as well if you just want to avoid this thing, and to play it that way. That being said, in this version, when you haven't played, like, to be fair, there probably isn't really a way they can kind of punish you for playing knight c6 before like castles, but that does give white this extra option of knight f4 that I think is a little bit annoying, and it's just something I would personally rather avoid, even if the engine doesn't think this position is so bad for black necessarily. But it just seems easier to just to avoid this altogether. But anyway, the choice is yours to which move order you want to play, like whether you want to castle ASAP or if you want to play knight c6 first at some point. Now, after bishop a6, it is true they do have a couple of other moves, like e4 is also going to be a move here. But it just gives us a very good version of a normal sort of Benko, because obviously the open center allows us to kind of leverage the weak king a lot more than in the lines with bishop a6 that we saw at the start of this video training. And we are actually pretty close to the end of it, so just hang in though. I'm saying it probably to myself as much as to you. But yeah, after bishop e7, g3. There is also the move of e5 actually. Like there are a few different ways to play because knight 3 does kind of transpose into lines that could also arise via 7 knight f3, which we'll actually get to pretty soon as it turns out. But yeah, up to g3 castles, king to g2. I mean, I think black has quite a few good options. It is very interesting to me that the move of d5, which seems very natural. I mean, I was going to say that it might not be the best one, but the engine thinks even this is going to be totally fine as well. I mean, black scored like +1, like with 2 out of 3 in the database. In all those games, white went bishop g5, and after like you can play it with d4, or you can play it with like h6. Like both options are going to be totally fine. Like this position is not at all worse for black. Like this knight d4 is a nice little trick to kind of secure the equality, as it were. But as it happens, I'm just kind of putting this in for the just for the PGN file students. So, but yeah, also as well as like this, white does have the move of rook e1, which is probably a better move. But even here, like black is it's just going to be fine in various ways, and I think you can sort of feel how when you like when you sort of have this very active piece play, it often means you'll have several good moves. It's kind of much harder to make a mistake when you have the initiative in a sense. So that's why I'm kind of showing like a few different options. So that if you like don't remember in a game, at least you kind of will like remember one of the two good options rather than like just like remembering the one I happen to mention when there are alternatives. But I do think Queen B6 might actually be potentially the most reliable equalizer. There is also this move that H6 that the engine kind of likes, but it does strike me as a little bit sort of computerish, this level of prophylaxis. So Queen B6 I think is just going to be the most natural move really. It opens the door for some moves like Knight D4 to get some very active piece play. If they play Rook B1, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of moves going to be fine. Like the idea of H6 here is kind of to, as opposed to maybe more natural move like Knight D4, is it's just basically to prepare the rooks being on this file without running into a Knight G5 move in response. And so something like this is just going to be very healthy for black. Like you can play, Rook D8, you can play G5, you can play Rook AF8. There's going to be a lot of moves that are going to give black a fine position. So you can kind of take your pick as to which one just sort of, resonates more to you intuitively or stylistically. And if they do play some move like A4 as the computer wants, yeah, just go Queen B7, maybe C4, and just kind of use the weaknesses to just give you very good long-term compensation. We kind of seen these ideas in the Benko as well, like how these sort of positions yeah, just it's going to be very, very healthy from Black's perspective. So anyway, that's yeah, showing the picture of e4 with g3, but what if they play e5? Well, I think we can be pretty happy to see e5 because then this pawn becomes quite weak, and White having a 0 out of 4 score in the database is obviously not a good sign for them. We can sort of see here, like if they do try to, like if they sort of don't like just give back the pawn to try to fight for equality, and instead they play like a move like bishop f4, which is kind of the move you would sort of expect White to play in a sense. But the problem though is that after castles, it's just very hard to defend this pawn properly. Because bishop g3, you run into knight d4, and suddenly it all just kind of falls apart a little bit for white. Like for example, if you take the knight, then you just have this decisive attack where like you just got everything focusing fire on f2, and there's just not much white can do about it because they're just playing down a rook and have the onus of defense of like defending their king. It's actually kind of a cool idea, the onus of defense, that even if you say you have 4 attackers and they have 4 defenders, their defenders aren't going to be as good as your attackers because they have to defend against your threats when there's the onus of, not getting checkmated, having to respond to checks and that sort of thing. I think it's a really nice way to kind of understand the initiative for those who maybe like don't get other explanations you've heard of it in the past. So in any case, in this position, if they do play g3 instead, I mean, there's various good moves for black here, but the way the engine wants to play is kind of fancy, where you just end up playing like knight f2 and just sacking the piece, but you end up sort of getting it back with tactics on this file. And yeah, I mean, the rising position just is, yeah, just horrible for white. Bishop d2 is obviously a mistake, but that's just showing you why white is, why white's not saying up a piece in this position. So in the end, yeah, e5 is a move you're going to be very happy to see as black. And yeah, I think that kind of shows the picture pretty well. I think we can move on to some of the other variations that white can play. And obviously, like, there are a lot of transpositions. I've kind of mentioned it before, but it does bear repeating. Now, if white goes knight to f3, yeah, I mean, in this case, I would probably just go for. There's like 2 different ways to play it. Like you could either play a move like, or even 3 ways as it turns out. Like you can go for knight c6. You can play d5, and you can even sort of play bishop e7, and the engine's kind of a little bit different between each of them, but I will kind of explain like what some of the differences are. Like with bishop e7, the thing is if you do play it this way, you're going to end up in a position where basically you're going to have the bishop on e7 rather than d6, which is why I was sort of recommending. And you can still play this. Like there was a game between Duda against Mamadjarov where Shah won as black. So you definitely can play that, but it just means you're kind of learning like a different way to play the position. And I mean, the video wasn't really 2.5 hours long. Maybe I would also cover it as a alternative just because it's really interesting. But I do think it is worth seeing like how some of the more aggressive moves kind of play out. The thing is, if you play d5, yeah, it means if they play e3, it's just going to transpose. But it does also give white a couple of other options as well, like moves like queen a4 or e4, for instance, to try to like use our move order against us. But fine enough in practice, white usually plays a move with bishop g5, but that just gives us a really fantastic position. Like, for example, if they play a move like e3, let's say, I mean, you just have this really strong initiative. Like, they have a lot of problems getting the king to safety, and the whole like bishop d5 just doesn't really gel with white's whole setup. Like, is basically just already going to be much better in a position like this one. So with that, yeah, you can see white's most common move up d5 isn't really that great. But as mentioned, they do have a couple other moves. Like if they go e4, I would probably just play bishop e7 and just castle and just kind of rely on the fact that you're going to have pretty good piece play for pawn. Like it kind of actually is transposing a little bit to what we were looking at just a bit earlier with that d5 move, funnily enough. And if they play queen a4, yeah, you just trade the queens, and I think black's compensation does endure into the end game. Like if they go e4, you can play it different ways, but one thing that you might find kind of interesting is that in a position like this, that rather than playing e takes d5, which is still totally fine by the way, but it was kind of just funny to me that the engine even says knight takes d5 is okay, because it's not, I think, a move that most humans would even really consider so much, but it's kind of interesting to see, yeah, even these weird moves like this are also fine for black. But that's going a little bit into the weeds because queen a4 is already a novelty, of course. You also can just play bishop e7 as well, like it's definitely also fine to let them take you and play a position like this as it were. But okay, I'm kind of getting a little bit carried away with some of these ideas, but this is just for the PGN file. And yeah, after I mean, I'll make d5 the main line just to where I analyzed it. But with the move at knight c6, yeah, it's going to, in a lot of cases, like, yeah, if they play like e4, it sort of transposes to what we saw those e4 lines a bit earlier. But if they play g3, it's kind of a point that if you do try to play d5, that this move order won't be as good because bishop h3 is actually giving white quite a strong attack. Like it just becomes really awkward to try and defend this pawn without allowing some other nasty thing to go on. So that's the thing. Like, if you are going to like play this, yeah, you probably I would recommend playing the D5 move order because now G5 is not going to come in. G5 is not going to come in time because instead of going for this thing we just saw, you can just play the move at D4 and that sort of throws off their whole initiative and just allows you like if Bishop A3 now you can play like D3 and that's going to give you the counterplay that you need to have a good position. Like you can even just sack the pawn and you're going to be down 2 or even 3 pawns, but their king is just stuck in the center pretty much for the rest of the game, and that's sort of where your compensation kind of comes from in a position like this. Like it's very sort of Layla zero coded this kind of play as black, like very very dynamic. So yeah, that actually kind of shows a little bit of the difference between the moves. I mean, if you do play knight e6 here, you're going to be kind of tied into that bishop e7 and some of those and this sort of thing we were looking at before. So I will include the Duda Mammoth draft game just saying yeah, it's kind of a good example if you want to do your own research. Like it's also been played by some strong players like Nakamura, Ho Yifan, Edouard, and some other strong players. But yeah, that's the other way you can look if you do want to look into the Bishop E7 approach. But yeah, for our purposes, yeah, if they do play, yeah, we already looked at the move at G3, so yeah, we can kind of move on from Knight C3, which as I said is the move you will face the most often. But what if they play a little bit differently? Like, what if they play E3 or G3, for example? Yeah, in this case, I think the D5 is just the more active move. Like, even though the engine will say that Bishop E7 and kind of like delaying the move of D5 is also technically reasonable. I do feel like, kind of in our heart, the move of D5 is a move we kind of want to play in a position like this. And also, if they do play Knight F3, which is what they usually do, it's going to kind of transpose back into the Blumenfeld Gambit territory like Knight F3 and then E3 and such. There are a couple other moves they can play, like Knight C3 and Bishop to B5 are like two options, which we'll get into like a bit later. But let's just start with Knight C3 F3 because like obviously there are also transpositions that can happen. Yeah, I'll make Knight C3 the most common move just because of the transpositional aspect of it. But I will also mention like the most common move in the database is the move of Bishop B5 immediately, just trying to get that sort of disruptive check in. Yeah, and also other moves like Bishop E2 and Knight D2 to not as critical, but those moves also do exist to be fair. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start with the move of Bishop to B5 first, and then kind of look at Knight C3 a bit later. Is what I've decided. So at this point, you already have a choice of whether to block with the Bishop or to block with the Knight. Um, so I'm interesting to see that Bishop B7 is actually a move that's kind of scored better, like in the database. Even though I think both moves are ultimately going to be like possible for black. But yeah, with bishop to d7, I mean white normally plays a move at knight takes bishop takes d7 in the database, which I think does kind of just help us a little bit. Is sort of my feeling. I think I prefer playing knight takes d7 rather than queen takes d7 here. Because yeah, with this like you're probably going to play knight a6 anyway in this version. It's like the kind of concept of keeping this c6 square for knight I think is just not really going to hold up quite as much from like an objective point of view. Like let's say if you do try to play like knight c6 here, it's like I'm just not really seeing black's compensation. Like I think white just is a bit too solid here. And, ways off to kind of hit back in the center. So I'm just not really seeing the queen side kind of being the avenue where black should be focusing on. Let's say. But okay, after knight b takes d7, if we do play out this sequence, and yeah, I mean white has a few different styles. Like you can put the knight on c3, you can play b3. There's different ways of doing it. Let's start with the move of b3 because that was the one that was a little bit the problem for black in the other kind of line. But yeah, after rook takes, you'll kind of see a little bit of a difference that with the knight rather than the queen on d7, it does allow us to play a move such as e5, which also is a new move, by the way. Like previously, they were playing the move of queen a8 in these sort of positions. Which I mean, to be fair, you can also do this. Like this is also going to be totally fine for black, of course. But just think, yeah, that moves like a4 and knight c3 ones that white probably wants to play anyway. So I'm just kind of saying, well, why not just play this immediately and just go for like the sort of attack like in the Alekhine kind of style, based on the famous Alekhine game in the Blumenfeld Gambit. Trying to remember who his opponent was. It was on like the old like top players. Just the name's kind of escaping me. Because name like Tartkar was entering my head, but I'm not sure if it was him. I think it might have been somebody else. Anyway, in this position, white does have to find the move of e4 if anyone says any problems. But then the computer kind of points out that c4 is actually quite a cool idea, where you're sort of just going for e4 and just kind of throwing everything at the king almost, or at the very least, just having very active piece play. And I mean, it's a bit of a computerish line, but I do think there's a lot of fun to be had with something like this, where you're just, just playing with the very active pieces and just making it very hard for white to consolidate. Like yeah, if they go bc4, you're already opening up, rook d6 and the rook coming in. So yeah, there's stuff like this that can, I think, be a lot of fun to play. But if you do want to keep a bit more tension in position, you can also play it this way and avoid the e4 problem by defending this pawn first. And I mean, that's probably the more human approach. That kind of the disadvantages that white does. I have the move at knight h4, which probably gives white a small edge here. I mean, there was an email game where like black did just play like this and managed to still like hold a draw, but it does seem to me like white should be a little bit better in this case. So yeah, e5 kind of the more probably objectively reliable equalizer. But queen a8 that's not the more human move because like knight draw is also a little bit computerish. So I think either way you're going to have a pretty decent position out of the opening as black. Now if they play knight to c3 instead, yeah, you can just play rook takes and there's actually transpose a position I think that also arises from a different move order. Like I think that if white plays, I was guessing it was coming from a knight c3 move, but actually might be coming from a different move order as such, like maybe 7 knight to c3 followed by e3 or something like that. But in any case, the point is that this position has arisen a bunch of times, and black has been scoring very well actually from this position. I really like the move of queen a8 actually, just lining up the pressure against the a pawn. And at that point, yeah, white usually goes e4 in the games we have here. But after e4, we can even just play a move like bishop to b8, for instance, and just kind of keep the out of the way of the e5 fork. And if they take, I think black is yeah just got very good play. Like you've got h6, d4, rook e8. Like black's got a lot of nice active ideas to kind of work with in this case. So yeah, you're definitely not going to have any problems with pretty much any of these moves as I kind of showed just a move ago. So if they do play b3, which is probably a bit less critical, but the sort of thing you might face a bit more often from maybe less advanced players, again, you kind of just go e5, and yeah, we're kind of looking at something similar to this, but when white's already played queen e2, which is kind of a better version for us, where like this just isn't really kind of having the same effect anymore when we can just jump in at d3 in time. Because if we kind of try to do that in the other position, like here, well, obviously, the bishop's kind of covering it, so that's sort of the difference there, with the first knight being on c3. In terms of other moves, they could play a move like b3 or a move like h3, I guess is one that does make some sense as well. But then you can even play moves like knight e5 as well, and just kind of have this very active piece play once again, something like this. You can also play c4 immediately, and there's another way you can also kind of bring the knight towards this outpost, which is a thing we've seen quite a lot in this video. It's very standard for the Benko. With that, I do also want to touch very quickly what if they do play it a little bit differently because the move a4 has actually been played in a couple of games. Although it's true the results weren't so good for white. Like I think just from a human point of view, probably just creating this weakness on b4 is a bit hard for white to play, even though the engine will say that like white is slightly better after like knight c3 instead of Macarian's b3 move. But yeah, you go knight b4, like you have pretty standard compensation for for the material here is black. Like the engine's kind of like playing knight c6, which is seems a little bit weird, but it's kind of connected with sort of playing in the center. So, but I will admit a4 is a move I think that does give white a little bit of an advantage. I kind of feel well like a very small advantage, and I kind of feel a similar way about knight c3 as well. That I think a position like this, where white doesn't sort of rush to trade, just kind of plays it a bit more patiently, or kind of waits until after we play knight a6 and then takes. So we don't have that knight d7 up we saw before. But yeah, I do think this is just going to be quite pleasant for white, and so that is a potential reason to explore knight d7 as an alternative. I kind of see how that sort of plays out. So in that case, yeah, white usually either goes castles or knight c3. But something interesting you'll kind of notice, at least I think I'm seeing this correctly, but basically in a position like this one here, you'll kind of notice, yeah, it's actually kind of like transposing into what we were looking at just before from the like bishop d7, knight takes d7 move order, just kind of happened in a different way of like, the exchange happening on a6 rather than on d7 for the bishops. But it does show, yeah, the kind of value of like looking in terms of like how the middle games play out, not just like opening moves, because yeah, there are a lot of move orders and yeah, knowing the move orders can definitely help you to get your bearings in different positions. For what it's worth, white does have the option of a4 that it can also play, but then you also can bring the bishop back and argue that that the bishop is like a little bit offside, and you can sort of try to play in the center in different ways. Like you also have a lot of flexibility when you've got the central space like this to work with. And they're not forced to play knight c3. There are some other moves that I can also try. I mean, if they play a4, this was one that the GM. Well, at least I thought it was played the game, then the game just vanishes from me. But yeah, it is basically going to transpose what we were just looking at. And if they play queen e2, yeah, you can just go queen b6 and just kind of get the pawn that way. We've already kind of discussed before how the end game is just typically going to be quite fine for black. That we just get this really nice piece play, and it's very hard for white to defend their weaknesses on the queen side properly when the queens are off the board somehow. Like as you sort of play this opening more, you'll kind of feel that for yourself intuitively. Or as you play through like the model games in the PGN file, both you get that. You'll really see that for yourself. Yeah, so if white does play a4, yeah, again, we've kind of looked at this a lot of different versions. Like we probably know the thematic ways to kind of deal with it by now, but it's just a reinforcement of that. And yeah, obviously if they play knight c3, I don't really have a better move than castling anyway. It's just going to transpose. But that's sort of the picture on bishop b5. And I don't realize I kind of went probably deeper in it than was strictly necessary. But I think it is, yeah, kind of important to know how these positions play out, like especially if you don't have experience with the Blumenfelder's black, like it's going to be a little bit new territory for you. So that really leaves us with the move of knight c3 is kind of the main other option, which, yeah, also there's going to be various transpositions. Like, for example, even we take bishop e2 here, if black were to play a move like bishop a6 and white were able to take, like, you could see how that could potentially transpose into some lines we were looking at, but in reality, it's probably not going to happen so much because, first of all, white can play castles and sort of wait for you to take them. And also, like, there's no need to kind of play knight d7 now when you can just, like, put the knight on c6 anyway, which is a more active square. So there are, like, some different subtleties, like, where it is actually very different compared to the bishop b5 lines we looked at, even though the structure is kind of similar. I think in this position, there's kind of. I think I would go for the move knight a6. I kind of like taking back with the knight in this position so that we can go bishop b7 and the bishop kind of supports the center to move forward like this. And yeah, white actually has a pretty broad choice of options according to the database. So, for example, like the most common move is b3 here, but there have also been some games with like knight b5 with bishop d2, e4, and to my surprise, actually, move a4 has never been played. Well, maybe it's not that surprising because allowing the knight to go to b4 outpost is very counterintuitive. But that's the one that the engine wants to play here for those who are wondering. But let's start with the most common moves and work our way back. So b3, as I just indicated, e5 is going to be a really good reply there. Where actually the move bishop e2 has never been played here, funnily enough, probably because the attack is just really, really strong for black when you've got the pawn on e4. Yeah, it's just very hard for white to challenge it, and you also have ways to use the d3 outpost to your advantage as well. So this is kind of an example of what white's trying to avoid, and I think this explains why you'll usually see white play moves like knight b5 or e4 trying to disrupt things, but after knight b5, we can even just play e4. Like, it actually doesn't even really, like, we don't even really care that much about knight d6, because if they do, like, take on d6 here, then we just are going to win a piece, because we've got the tactics working in our favor. Queen e2, queen b6, and evidently the knight is trapped, and, the free pawns are not going to be sufficient compensation for the piece for white. So they're going to move the knight, and then this knight just ends up a little bit out on a limb, right? Like, you can go knight c7, you uncover this. If they take, well, then you're now also attacking the pawn, so it's just going to be a very, very nettlesome position for white to play. And if they go e4, a good thematic reply to e4 is just go d4, just kind of shut down the position that way. And, they can play knight h g5 and somewhat justify their play, but, like, pretty much anything is going to be fine for black here. Like, you can, play bishop takes d5 and then knight b4. You can play knight takes d5 and knight b4. Like, either way, you're just going to kind of go after this pawn and just have a very nice position with your strong center backed up by the pieces. So this is to show, yeah, that the most natural move for white at b3 is actually probably a little bit of an inaccuracy, after which black is probably already one who's pressing a little. So what if they play a little differently? What if they play knight b5? Well, we just bring the bishop back with bishop b8. Yeah, and in that case, like, the move a4 is probably a move white should play if they want to fight for an advantage, because b3 is kind of a little bit like kind of what we've seen before, except here, like, instead of e5, you might go knight c7 instead and just, like, get the knight out of the way and then think about this kind of stuff. And if they do play a4, I think that knight e4 is a good move. I think knight c7 is also pretty good. Like, it's obviously not a super theoretical position, but it's just to help you, give you like a few different plans you can kind of work with once you get to the middle game. Bishop d2, yeah, you can just play like knight c7, and yeah, I mean, it is clear that black is just very comfortable. Like, if they go b4, you can even just play c4 and just kind of just shut down these pawns and still have your own play in the center to work with. Like, clearly your majority is a lot stronger than theirs in the middle game. It's only in the end game that the outside majority becomes a bit more important. And after e4, yeah, I would just play knight takes e4. Like, white's position is not terrible, but it's sort of evident that white is the one who is kind of fighting for equality in a position like this. And yeah, knight 7 is like an improvement over the Kazakowski Kovalev game from the Belarus Championship 2018. Because in the game, like, black played queen f6 and kind of ran into a little equalizing tactic for white, whereas knight c7, yeah, just avoids that altogether by making sure our bishop is all protected. Again, a good example of loose pieces drop off. All our pieces are protected here as black, so it guards against potential tactics. Yeah, if they go h3, it's just kind of a bad move, like, just go e5, e4 and destroy them. And yeah, if a4, I actually think I would probably lean towards a move like knight c7 just to cover knight b5. And yeah, I mean, the plan will be just like queen e7, like play e5 at the right time, and I don't really see any huge problems for black. I come to queen 7, that's maybe one of the rare moments where maybe you could also play like queen e8 rather than queen e7. But yeah, you can look at it more deeply if you want to. This is kind of getting very much into like engine-like territory more than like what you'll get it over the board most likely. So anyway, moving to some other ways they could play it. Yeah, what if they play bishop to d3? Well, in that case, it just kind of is a bit of a dubious decision by white, because yeah, you can just go knight b4 and they're losing time with the bishop. We've got e5 coming in, and we just have a very strong attack because we are now defending the pawn on d5. So yeah, bishop e3 not a good move for white. If they play e4, then yeah, it's not such a bad move to be fair, but I think that the rising position after something like this is still going to be totally fine. Like, you just are going to get your pieces active. Like, if bishop c4 is moves like rook d4 to kind of keep the momentum for black, and in the end, like, in a position like this one, black is going to have good counterplay. Like, I hate to go too deep into it, it's probably going a little too into the weeds, but you can sort of check yourself and see that positions like this are just absolutely fine for black, with white really struggling to again, get their queenside developed. Not the first time I've said that in this training. Now, what if they play a quieter sub, like say they go bishop to e2, and they just decide not to play knight c3, but go for sub like b3, knight d2, this kind of thing. It has happened in a few games, like obviously knight c3 transposed to what we were just looking at just before. But yeah, with these positions, like let's just say we take knight d2 as our main line here, just because it's the more common move in practice. In this case, I think c4 actually may potentially punish White's move order a little bit. This one is a novelty as well, where it's kind of clearing that space, sort of interfering with the move of b3 by being able to play c3 in response and just coming up the knight like that. And also, there are also moves like knight b4. Like this sort of shows a little bit why I think the move of knight of b3 is a bit of a better move order for White here, even though it's less common because it does sort of take some of the sting out of knight b4 in that sense. And so what I'd probably do instead is probably just play like queen at e7, say bishop b2, and then there's a lot of good moves like e5 is probably the one that'll give like the most reliable equality, like just again those d5, e4 ideas we've seen before. Like this will just give like very good active play for the pawn. Um, Actually, now I think actually maybe it's worth thinking a little bit deeper on this position. Like this one's actually probably a bit more critical. So yeah, knight to b4, yeah, would probably be a better square for the knight, or even just taking the pawn as it were. But yeah, you can sort of see black is basically fine here. Yeah, you can also play like bishop to b7 first, and like it's not the most precise, but it's not going to make the world's biggest difference if like you mix up the move order in the game. And yeah, if they do play like knight b2, it's kind of just going to be like what we were sort of talking about before, with like c4 and this sort of thing being just very nice for black. So in fact, already like probably has to play a move like knight b1 just to not be worse, which is very unlikely, I think, for someone to play an actual game. But yeah, I think that gives a pretty good picture of the position of e3 and knight f3. I will just very quickly check as well to see if there is any sort of independent value to white, like not playing knight f3. I mean, bishop e5 is one way, I guess, but the thing is, like, they're usually going to play like knight f3 anyhow and just kind of transpose. If bishop d7, there was one game, like a very old game, where white played the move queen to a4, but it just was a bit of a mistake, like after knight a6, like the queen is clearly like quite misplaced on a4, so it's just going to transpose in any case to what we're just looking at. So no real independent value. And I suspect that bishop e5 is probably going to be a similar story, but I'm just going to check and make sure. But yeah, like after knight d7, if they do play some move like knight e2 as it happened in one game in 2010, I mean the knight is, to be fair, the knight's actually not that bad on the e2 square compared to f3. So yeah, I mean it is an option for white for sure. But I still think black gets pretty normal compensation. I think white has only like a tiny edge at best in a position like this, and we still have ways to get active counterplay for the pawn and all of that. But yeah, that is maybe a reason also like why like bishop d7 could be considered in that case. And yeah, I mean we've kind of looked at these sort of positions a bit earlier, so just going back to familiar territory. Anyhow, yeah, I think that shows the picture of e3 just very, very well. And with the move of g3, I mean it's a move that if they play knight c3 late, it's going to transpose to some things we are kind of looking at before. But looking at here, yeah, I can kind of see that. So this one's kind of interesting. Like, there's a few different ways you can approach this as black, but basically the most common move is to go like d5 and yeah, kind of like play like this thing like we kind of saw before. Actually, I think in that version the knight was already on c3, but like if you go bishop d6, their best move is going to be probably to play knight c3 anyway, as such. Like they're going to do it probably sooner or later. But yeah, they also have moves like knight h3, like they can definitely go for something like this, and yeah, we can. And I mean, in this case, yeah, it's a bit of a different position as we haven't played bishop a6 yet. Is kind of the difference, but if we do play bishop a6, and yeah, this is kind of going to transpose back to the main line of what we were looking at before. At the same time, when they play g3, it does actually give us some extra options that are quite interesting, which is kind of why I was pausing it a little bit before. So like after d5, bishop g2, I find the move of rook a6 is actually a very interesting alternative here, where we're just basically taking the pawn and kind of keeping this square for the knight more so, rather than playing like knight a6. But we're also keeping this bishop defending the pawn, which is kind of the difference with bishop takes a6. Now, white usually does play knight f3. Yeah, they can also play knight to c3, but it's probably going to end up transposing anyway after like a later, later knight f3 and so forth. So knight f3 is going to be what we'll focus on a bit more. And then it's like, yeah, bishop to e7, castles. You can castle or play knight c6. Knight c6 might be the slightly more accurate move order, but the difference is going to be very marginal, to be fair. So in this case, yeah, the move at knight c3 is sort of the way White was normally playing it. We'll also quickly touch on b3, but yeah, this is just going to be very good for Black. So knight c3, castles, and actually, yeah, this does actually transpose into a more familiar position. Like we kind of saw the Mamajara version with bishop a6 instead of rook a6, but this is something that has arisen from a lot of different other positions, like basically the Blumenfeld gambit, yeah, with whites, like playing this move of g3 and then like knight f3 later in a sense. Well, that's the way we kind of did it here, but in any case, white does have a choice basically between either bishop to g5 or bishop f4, kind of the two main options white has at their disposal. There are also a couple of games with the move of b3 too. But like I said before, like e5 is going to be really strong and you can't really punish white for, not sort of keeping a grip over the center. And like e4, d4, very kind of seen how those sort of positions are just going to be quite nice for black. And so with that, we can, we can focus on the more common continuations by white. So we'll start with bishop g5 just because it's the most common move, even though I do think bishop f4 is probably the better try for white. But bishop g5, we can just play the move of h6 and just kind of put the question to the bishop. It's sort of too late for him to kind of admit the mistake, because if you go bishop f4, then g5 becomes a very nice way to sort of kick that bishop out of the way and just have a really, really strong center, kind of like we've seen before, yeah? So the big question really is bishop f6, and normally they'll play a move rook c1, like trying to argue that they, made the c5 pawn a bit more weak, but the thing is we can just play c4. There are also alternatives, like queen a5 is also a pretty decent option for black as well, if you do want to keep a little bit more flexibility in the structure, like with some ideas like this being kind of some typical moves the engines are kind of want to play at different points here. But I'm going to focus, and I'll also add a correspondence game as well, just for reference. But in the case of c4, yeah, I just think it's really nice to just fix this pawn as a potential target. Probably the only disadvantage is it does kind of liquidate the position a little bit more quickly. Well, at least that's what I was going to say, but actually it's not really true because this position here is still very dynamic, obviously, with having the connected passed pawns, moves like knight b4 in the mix. Like I think it's a position that even though the engine is saying that it's equal, I do think it looks very scary to have these pawns kind of in your face like that. But you can pick either of these moves depending on what just feels more right to you and the situation you're kind of in the game as well. So, but yeah, bishop d5 overall definitely not one of the more critical moves. The move bishop f4 is going to be more annoying by comparison. And in this case, I do think it is kind of important that we play the move of knight h5 because if we do play d4, I think that knight b5 is just really annoying and white can very easily get a kind of, this pressure on our center and potentially a blockade on these squares is just very hard for us to really resist. And so we really should play knight h5 here and after bishop to d2. If they do play a move like e3, trying to get a structure like this, I mean, you can still play this, even though I feel like it's kind of a lot easier to play white here after rook e1, but you can also just keep the tension with a move like bishop f6 and kind of just wait a moment, like wait for him to play h4 and, then play like takes and then you can sort of get a better version. Or you can also play a move like h6 as well and just, get some counterplay ideas like in the future. Maybe not so much with g5, it's probably going to be more with c4 in this version, to be fair. So still kind of something like this. But if they had to play some of these moves that maybe wouldn't have made otherwise, it is a nice thing for us. So those are different ideas you kind of play around with, like E3 I do think is a very interesting try, and one I would probably play with the white pieces, honestly. But if they do play bishop d2, which is what you will see in the games based on the database, then you do kind of have to play like knight to f6. Like I understand it's not ideal to let him kind of repeat moves and potentially make a draw, but if you do want to play for a win, like there are alternatives. Like you can also play like bishop e7, for example, and kind of play these positions like I was showing briefly a bit earlier. So there are like other options you can go for that still use a similar kind of ideas if you want to avoid a potential repetition. But in practice, actually, White was normally playing other moves. Like they're normally playing moves like Queen to B C2 or Knight B5 was what each of the games went with. But Queen C2 just allows E5, and we're just getting again very good play. Like you can even just take actually because you kind of have some fun moves like Rook F3, and you get two minor pieces for the Rook there. Or if they play Knight B5, it just ends up being a bit dubious. E5, and they're not even getting in the move of E4 that we seem to be in a very thematic counter to fight back against center for White. And without that, yeah, White is just going to be in a difficult spot. So yeah, that kind of shows the picture on G3, I think, pretty well. And yeah, there's other move orders you can also play like Bishop to E7 or Rook A6. Like it's often just going to transpose in a lot of cases, but yeah, you can explore that in your own time if you want to go deeper into what is relatively speaking a sideline. With the move Knight F3, like obviously, that is going to be quite an important bridge for us in a way because obviously there are a lot of transpositions possible and even kind of very likely. I did notice that the move of Bishop A6 is the one that is the most common. You can also play the move of D5, like it's also reasonable. And a lot of the time it is just going to transpose to what we looked at, like if they play E3, G3 it just transposed to other lines we saw. Same thing with E3. And then if they do play a move like Knight C3, I mean they're just kind of asking for D4 with kind of a nice initiative for black. So the lazy option is to play D5 and just transpose, but you can also play Bishop A6 if you do want to punish their move order a little bit more. Because once again, with this sort of position, I'm trying to actually remember my parents like what I sort of recommended because like so much different territory to cover. But yeah, if you do play with Bishop A6 again, you're probably very likely to end up in this kind of position that I mentioned before, like the version with the Mamadjara version. I kind of called it. So yeah, like I said, it's probably true if I had covered this like in the video, I would have like quite a bit of payoff because you get a few different versions. But yeah, I just ultimately decided that I don't want a video to be too long and just rather just let you explore it if you want to because there are ways like to avoid it as I've demonstrated. But of course, black is also objectively fine here, so that's also a nice point. The final move I'll cover is if they do play e4, it is basically a bluff, like you can just take, and white just doesn't really get what they're looking for from this. Like you have this idea of just playing knight c6, just kicking the queen and just being much better with your material. And if they play bishop b5, trying to avoid that, given that bishop g5 is kind of a dead end for white here. Well, in that case, we can even just play a move like queen e7. Like this is a novelty that the computer points out, just with the idea of preparing bishop g7 without sacking the pawn. And I mean, when you're just going to take back the pawn and have a strong center, and their queen is also rather misplaced in a position like this. So I just think black is just slightly better in a case like this one. So yeah, that really kind of concludes the picture pretty well on this whole like e6 move that we talked about. So I'm sort of like debating like, do I cover it? Okay, actually, I'm going to include something that I originally was going to cover, but I think it's kind of come up so often. I think I should just talk about it rather than putting it off. So with this thin line I just showed you, I actually am going to talk through like the different ways it can play out from like this position and some of the different versions. Because even though it'll make the video a bit longer, I think it's going to really serve you very well to know that you can always play this up in the worst case. And it'll kind of guard you against having to remember, like, because there are a lot of different tricky move order points, like with me trying to avoid this sort of position. And so I do think it's going to be easier just kind of allow it and just, just show you how it works. So let's start with this position first of all, just kind of like go really kind of deep into how it plays. So the move that's most common for white is the move of rook to e1. which we'll kind of see a bit of the details later. But I do also want to quickly mention that White does have some alternatives like knight to g5, and it's kind of just listing moves just I kind of remember to refer to them later, so as you can easily forget such things. And yeah, we'll make a4 like yeah the final move that I will address. So okay, so with rook e1, like I sort of indicated before, that yeah, the move for black that will be the best one here is pawn to h6, and it's just kind of a good waiting move. Like you just take away some annoying lines where they can try to go after your e6 pawn, which is something you have to watch out for sometimes when you have the bishop on e7. But it's also kind of a good waiting move where you're just kind of preparing for the queen to kind of just come into the attack later with queen e8. Like that's sort of a big difference you'll see. Like when the bishop was on d6, we kind of had some good squares like e7 for the queen, but here we're definitely going to be using the e8 square a lot more. I will mention as an honourable mention, like queen h7 is also a possible move. Queen d7, I should say, which is going to be a little bit more connected with central play, but I do think that h6 is probably the one I would deem to be the more reliable of, between them. So at this point, White has a few different moves that they've played, like the move of Bishop f4 is probably the best one. Like it's one move like where White's can is basically not just giving Black a very good game from the outset. But there also have been some other moves played, like b3 has been played a bunch. Knight h4 has also been played a bunch here. So there's a few different ways White can play it. But I'm going to start with b3 actually, because it's going to be kind of nice to see how this sort of attack plays out. Like for example, they go bishop to b2, you just go d4, and you can kind of see this already just gone very badly for white. Then you move like knight g4, and you just like sack mate kind of thing in a position like this. Like all the pieces are in the attack, so they're going to sacrifice something and win the game. Basically, is kind of the idea. So I mean, bishop e2 is kind of a mistake, but even if they do play like bishop a3, for instance, well, you can just kind of go queen f7 and knight e4, and there's just not really going to be any sort of real pressure from white. You just have like a very strong initiative for the pawn simply, and yeah, and there's also some reasons like knight d4 can be a trick as well to try to get f2. But in any case, if they do play knight h4, yeah, just queen e8 just covers that very nicely, and it's kind of hard to actually get the knight in there. Because queen c2, you've got moves like knight g4 to kind of bring the pieces in the attack in this sort of way. And, if they do play something like e4, which is the more common move here, yeah, there's a few good replies. Like you can even just go d4, and I mean, even that's going to be pretty good. Intrian also thinks d4 is better for black. It's a bit less natural to my mind, but it also is going to be quite good. But the point is that, yeah, e4 just is not remotely scary in this case. Well, it's scary, but it's scary for white. So bishop f4, yeah, really is the move white should be playing. But then we do have a few options. Queen e8 is kind of the thematic move here, but I do think that, yeah, I mean, queen e8 is gonna be perfectly fine. There are some other alternatives like d4 and knight d5 that is kind of the way the engine wants to try to force equality. Just like it can lead to pretty crazy lines like here, and positions like gets very complicated very fast here. Like e3, yeah, you can like d3 is sort of meant to be the clean equalizer, but there's also like other moves you can play if you want to like kind of take more risk, but also have like more chance to try to win. Though to be fair, I think the position's still pretty dynamic enough after d3 anyway. So, but okay, this is going a little bit off topic because I do think the move of queen e8 is also a pretty good one here. And kind of the plan is just going to be just going to go kick away their bishop and just start kind of attacking them essentially. So it means that if they play like a4 for example, just go g5 and just kind of ready to like either push in the center or if e4 queen f7 just kind of have that pressure down the f file that just makes it really hard for white to consolidate in a position like this one. Also, could note whether that we take with the knight, not the pawn, just to avoid some engine tactics like these sort of things in the mix. So we do want to keep our eyes open, of course. But a4 already is a little bit of a computer move and a novelty here by white. In the actual game I had in the database, like white played rook c1, but that just gives you just very easy play. Like black is clearly very very, very comfortable in a position like this one. Like if he's just so much more active than the opponent is not even funny. So with that, we can kind of move, I think, to some other options for white that are, yeah, I mean, in all cases, black is doing okay. But if they do play knight g5, I think just queen d7 is a good reply. They'll usually play bishop d3 to try to justify it. But again, we can just kind of cover the knight in the e6 pawn in this way. You don't avoid anything like, some rook e1 and e3 being a bit of a nuisance. So knight d8, yeah, just avoids that problem clearly. So at this point, there's kind of a few different moves that White's played in practice. Like Black's doing fine in all different cases, but just to I'll just put the moves on the board again. Like this is just my way of kind of make sure I kind of cover all the key things. And when you're working on your own openings, your own time, you can obviously do a similar, like just like kind of like listing the moves that kind of exist, like listing the candidates. Like when you're calculating the chess game, right? You kind of come with your candidate moves and you like analyze them in a sense. It's kind of like what we're doing here, just for openings. And yeah, I mean after b3, I just like playing h6, and there were a couple of games where Black played the move of knight c6, but I do think in that case you are going to run into some problems with the pawn coming up fire, like in a Neverov against Singh game from December 2025, so quite a recent game. But a pretty easy improvement here is just to go queen e8. The difference now being that we can now kick away their bishop. And then that means when you do play knight c6, yeah, you're not going to have that pressure on the pawn anymore. Meaning, yeah, your position's going to be a lot more free. You can also defend the d4, the c5 pawn, like with either d4 is one way to do it, or the other way is go bishop b5 and defend in a more tactical way with the pin on the a file. But in either case, black is going to have quite a good position. Like we have very active piece play here. So it kind of explains, yeah, why black is just doing fine. Queen a4 is, I mean, any move is going to be fine. But like queen d6 is probably the easiest, and just leaving this piece a little bit awkward. Queen c2, yeah, just play h6. Like if they do play, well, yeah, they can't really do any tricks in this position. So yeah, they're just queen just looks very weird on c2 somehow, and you're just going to play the normal kind of plans. And after rook e1, yeah, even just like bishop b7 or h6, like you're going to see, it's like just very thematic. It's black very often playing the same kind of ideas in all of these cases, but just showing it to you several times so it kind of sinks into that long-term memory as such. If they do play bishop f4, which I mean is probably one of the best moves for white actually in this position once again, but yeah, I mean in that case there's various good moves. Like d4 is actually a novelty if you do want to explore a bit more of a forcing approach. But king h8 is the one I think that yeah, give the most kind of give like the most tension still in the position. Because yeah, in this case after like rook's is the one to move they've usually played. I don't think a4 maybe is a move that white should explore if they want to fight for an advantage, but we can still always like in the worst case play knight here and back, and offer this sort of silent off repetition of moves. And if you want to play for a win like queen b6, I think should also be quite adequate for black. Like maybe white has a tiny advantage, but you don't really care too much about that if you're if you're playing for the full point. But if they do play rook to c1, then yeah, just knight h5 is again just going to be quite good. And here actually the idea is not so much to repeat moves, but you can actually just go e5 and just really throw everything at the center, and that's going to be very difficult for white to deal with. So that's the reason why white usually does play the move knight to e5 in the practice. But in that case, there's various fine moves. The easiest is probably just go queen e8 and just play something like this where the king is obviously a bit out in the open here, right? And something like this just have very standard, very typical compensation for the pawn, like we've seen many times before. And I mean, if they do get tricky, like you also can be tricky as well, and playing with like knight e3 to secure a very full compensation in a position like this. So anyway, if they do play a4, finally, that's one of the moves the Indian thinks is interesting. But king h8, you can kind of do this once again. And yeah, like bishop f4, just transpose kind of what we were looking at just a moment ago. And if you don't play bishop f4, I guess they can play queen knight g5. Maybe that's an idea, but yeah, in that case, you can just go like queen c8, and the thing is, you're not even limited to knight d8. Like you can actually play knight d4 here, and just kind of kick away the knight, and that's just going to give you the kind of active play that you're sort of looking for here as black. Position kind of gets a little bit crazy, like a bit computerish evaluation sort of thing, but or computer move thing. But ultimately, yeah, black is going to have a pretty good position with the strong center and the bishop being kind of under control for the moment. Okay, so that leaves really just what if they don't play knight c3. Rook e1 is a move that has actually been played quite a bit, but after d5, they're almost certainly going to play like, well, I was going to say they're almost certainly going to play knight c3, but actually maybe it's not quite that simple because they do also have the move of knight g5 that actually has been a little bit more common, excluding transpositions. And I mean, yeah, in that case, like queen to d7, they do have some ideas like this where they can actually kind of fight for a little bit of an advantage potentially. Like just saying they've got a good blockade over the central squares here. Like even though you can still technically make it work, I do think we can probably do a little bit better than something like this. And then that's a reason why I think a move such as h6 is actually a very interesting idea. And it's also a novelty, by the way. Like we're just stopping them from playing knight g5 and preparing d5. Because like if they go knight c3, it is transposed kind of to what we were just looking at a bit earlier, right? With the knight c3 rook e1 move order. And if they do try to punish the move order, I mean, we can just meet knight 12, queen e8. Like that's obviously not going to be too much of a problem because even though our structure sucks, they do have very long-term issues with their king safety, or even we could say immediate issues with their king safety if white is a bit careless here. So that's not really going to be an issue. And e4 is a move that might look annoying, but actually after knight g4, it just ends up just being really good for black. We can just kind of use the weakness of d3 to your advantage. Because I'm kind of assuming the reason people haven't played h6 because they're afraid of e4, but it just kind of ends up just being a mistake for white at the end of the day. So anyway, that's a free novelty for you there. And if knight bd2, I think knight b2 is just like a very limp kind of move, honestly. Like if white goes rook e1 in this position, he just goes c4 and I just don't really see what white's doing. Like b3 runs into e3. You've got like bishop c5 and this sort of thing coming, e5. I just think white's position is just really, really bad. And the engine kind of confirms that as well. Like you can even just, play a move like bishop c8 and, still it's not really clear what white's really doing. Like black still has a very strong attack in a position like this, to enter one line for the PGN file students. It's going a bit into the weeds, but just to show the picture of white is that black is very happy in these sorts of lines. Um, now I think there's also other moves in bishop c8, but let's not get too carried away. And if they do play b3, just knight e4 is just going to punish them a little bit for not kind of getting their knight out first. So, I mean, a position like this is actually just going to be really bad for white as it turns out, because queen c2, knight b4 is kind of a trick that just kind of forces the winner material. So, I think with that, that's a good note to conclude this video, which has like really focused very deeply on the move of e6, and I think this might actually be the first video I've ever done on YouTube that's like over 3 hours long. So I must be taking like a pretty good rest after this one, that's for sure. But I think it was kind of nice, to really show like what a kind of professional approach, like what a real deep dive into the modern Benko Gambit looks like. And also, this is a really kind of litmus test, right? If you're happy playing this line as black, like all the other variations white can play against Benko are just not as critical as, just taking the pawn in a sense. And so if you're happy with this, I mean, you're very likely going to be happy with all of the other variations as well. So anyway, that's the training. And if you do want to have like the PGN and also like the model games analyzed as well on top of this, then what you can do is you can just like click on the link in the description or the pinned comment. And with that, it will just give you the access to at a very, very cheap price. But with massive values you've seen with this training like being so long. So with that being said, thank you for your attention, and I will see you in the next one.